Good morning. State Board, come back to order. Ms. Cordial, will you please call the roll?
Board Member Durham.
Here.
Board Member Flores.
Here.
Board Member Goff.
Here.
Board Member McClellan.
Here.
Board Member Rankin.
Here.
Board Member Shuffle.
Here.
Board Member Schroeder.
Here.
Thank you.
We'll get that one fixed up. First item on our agenda this morning is the consideration of the rules for the administration statewide system to evaluate the effectiveness of licensed personnel employed by school districts and boards of cooperative services, 1 CCR 301-87. I ask that staff give a brief presentation before I'll take a motion. Commissioner?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to turn this over to Mary Bivens, the Director of Educator Development, and Jennifer Simons, Educator Development Specialist.
Thank you, Dr. Anthus. Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the board. As Katie said, I'm Mary Bivens, the Director of Educator Development, and here today with Jennifer Simons, our Educator Development Specialist. We are going to go over the changes made. As you may remember, we brought all 3 rule packages that we're going to talk about this morning to you in March, and we opened them for public comment, and then we had hearings at last month's board meeting, and we're coming to you today with action items for all 3 of the rule packages. Today we'll go over changes made since last month's board meeting based on both public comment and on board direction. You have the red line versions with you, quite a package for you today. Those also include the technical changes done by a final review by the AG's office. So the first rule package that we're going to go over today is the rules for administration of a statewide system to evaluate the effectiveness of licensed personnel, which is 1 CCR 301-87, and those are from Senate Bill 10191. As a refresher, these rules were updated for 2 primary reasons. 1, to remove the outdated language that had been in the rules that were initially brought forth, and also to streamline the teacher quality standards and their related elements. After testimony at the May public hearing, there has been no additional written comment received regarding these educator effectiveness rules. And with no board request for changes on this item, CDE staff are not recommending any additional changes, and we are open to discussion or questions.
Board Member McClellan.
I just wanted to say thank you to staff for meeting with me to answer questions I had about some of the rule changes and to talk with me about some of the concerns that I had been hearing, and I wanted to thank you very much for taking the time to meet with teachers about their concerns as well. So thank you for that.
Appreciate that.
I would appreciate a comment. The May public hearing, there was a request that the implementation be slowed down. Could you explain what they're speaking about?
Absolutely, Madam
Please.
Chair.
I'm not sure what they're even asking you to slow down before we
Yes.
decide whether we want to slow down.
Thank you. The request was made at the last meeting to not have a board vote in May, but to delay that till this month for more time to talk about some other questions that those educators had.
So we're good. Any other questions or comments? Oh, I need a motion.
So will we be covering those questions? Can you share those?
Yeah.
The questions they had
Yes.
related not to what was in rule, which were the teacher quality standards and their related elements, but rather about implementation practices within districts. And so we were able to discuss some guidance we have and support we can give for that.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Could someone please make a motion? Board Member Sheff.
I just had a question. So, with respect to the letter from the East Central BOCES, that is relevant not to the portion that we're looking at right now, is that
You are correct.
So the portion we're looking at right now, as far as the summary of the changes, they're reflected in the red line version.
Correct.
And also in the PowerPoint, or is the PowerPoint summative across all 3 sections.
The PowerPoint, we will be taking each
Each one.
section at a time, so this is now just for the educator effectiveness rules.
I haven't heard any amendments.
I move to approve the rules for the administration of a statewide system to evaluate the effectiveness of licensed personnel employed by school districts and boards of cooperative services. 1 CCR 301-87.
So proper motion, do I have a second?
Second.
Any further discussion, ladies and gentlemen? Would you call the vote, please?
Board Member Durham.
Yes.
Board Member Flores.
Yes.
Board Member Goff.
Yes.
Board Member McClellan.
Yes.
Board Member Rankin.
Yes.
Board Member Shuffle.
Yes.
Board Member Schroeder. Yes. Thank you. That passes unanimously.
Thank you. Next item on our agenda is the consideration of the rules for the Colorado Educator Licensing Act of 1991, 1 CCR 301-37. I ask that staff, again, give a brief presentation before I'll take a motion.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Morning, members of the board. Just as a refresher, this particular rule package is the package that added the English learner professional development pathways, as well as updated language to align with recent legislation. Written comment and testimony at the public hearing you heard in May included concern about the definition of core teacher that was included in the English learner professional development pathways, the number of times a teacher must demonstrate this requirement, clarification about waiver provisions, specifically and how they relate to charter schools authorized by the Charter School Institute, and concern about the 90 clock hour requirement and how that relates to our alternative educator preparation programs. Based on feedback, CDE staff proposed clarifying language in response to public comment, and those revisions included the removal of the definition of a core teacher, and instead inserting a clarification that these requirements apply only to those teachers who hold endorsements in elementary, math, science, social studies, and English, as well as a clarification that this requirement must be met once during the duration of an educator's license. At the May meeting, the board requested staff to investigate a practical option for implementing the superintendent waiver option in charter schools authorized by CSI. Just as a reminder, this waiver would be available to districts with less than 2% identified English learners in the last 3 years. After further research, CDE staff are recommending that charter school principals sign off on the waiver provisions for CSI authorized charter schools. And at this time, and that is if the charter school has had an average of 2% or fewer identified English learners in the last 3 years. At this time, I want to pause to allow time for any discussions or questions regarding these recommendations covered so far before I move to the 90 clock hour discussion.
Colleagues, any questions? Not for change? Proceed.
Thank you. In regard to the 90 clock hour comments that were heard, there was testimony heard at the May public hearing, as well as written comment that the board received after that hearing that requested that alternative educator preparation programs, the requirements for those programs be revised to reflect 45 hours over 5 years for those candidates, as opposed to the 90 hours that were written into the version that you've seen. CDE staff have not made any additional changes to this aspect of the rules. Rules currently read 90 clock hours for all educator preparation programs, including alternative educator preparation entities. And at this time, we are open to any questions or discussions that board members may have regarding this part of the rules.
Board Member Rankin?
I'm going to go back a little bit for the 2% for the principal sign-off. Is that the one where we spoke about 2% of English language learners?
Yes. So if the reported percentage of English learners in the district is less than 2% over the last 3 years, the superintendent could submit a waiver request on behalf of the educators in that district. And what this clarification adds is the ability for a principal of a charter school authorized by CSI to do that for that school as well, if that school were eligible under those same provisions.
Thank you for that clarification.
So the principal has to take the training, or what?
No, ma'am. The principal would submit the waiver request to CDE, just like the superintendent of a district would.
For the teachers?
Yes.
And even though I think that the projection is that the number of second language learners will probably be growing. I mean, that is the projection for, I think, the
Val,
state.
this is a waiver in the case of a district or a charter school where 2% or less of their students are second language learners for the past 3 years. So it doesn't really address
The
whether there's a
future.
growth, the future, whether there's a growth or not.
Yeah, well.
And that
that's-
waiver is, I'm assuming that waiver is not permanent, that once those demographics change, that waiver is no longer in.
How often do they do a waiver review? That's the
Yeah, I
question.
know, we did, that's
What you wanted.
is it a 3-year moving average? Is it every 3 years? Did we even address that?
We wrote in that it's over the last 3 years at the time the waiver is submitted, and I think
Uh-huh.
we should probably go back and look and make sure the language is clear as to how long that waiver is in effect.
Right.
Since there's a one-time requirement that an educator needs to meet this, you know, and superintendents don't have to do that waiver, right? They can make that choice. So I think what you're making us think of some really good points as we do implementation, to think about how that will look for implementation. So, because if the waiver's given once, they move to another district, and that district meets it, they'll need to, in that next full cycle, for their renewal of their license. So they would have a waiver from that one district, right, that met under 2, but when their next cycle comes up, they would, if mattering where they were, it would be considered again. So I think this is probably an implementation practice that we haven't gotten down to those details.
Yeah, but
quite yet.
that's not what I was questioning.
Okay,
A district for 3 years has 2% or less,
uh-huh,
and then suddenly they have 5%
correct.
the following year.
Mhm.
What effect does that have on their waiver?
So the waiver isn't for the district as a whole, it's they give it to that educator, because remember, this falls on the educator. So when Mary Bivens comes to renew my license, I would have to ask for that waiver in that moment. So whether that's 6 years from now, 5 years from now, or 9 years from now. So it would be a moving target if they grew.
So I misunderstood. It's not the superintendent who gets the waiver.
Well, that's what I thought too, but.
It's the teacher who gets the waiver in a district where the superintendent
Approves them.
gives
Yes.
an approval of the waiver.
You've got it. Mhm. So that could change if I get the waiver in 5 years from now, but 9 years, another teacher tries to apply and our numbers have grown, then it wouldn't, the superintendent couldn't do the waiver. Does that make sense?
Sure.
But.
Board Member McClellan, just a
I'm
second.
so sorry, just to follow up to this line of questions. So let's say teacher A got the waiver, and as Chairwoman Schroeder points out, the district then bumps up above the waiverable percentage. Let's say they go to 5% English language learners. Will we recapture the opportunity to require that teacher who had a prior waiver? Will it automatically recapture all the waivered teachers and bring them back in and tell them, okay, now you no longer have a valid waiver?
What'll happen is at their next full renewal cycle, if
Okay.
you don't have the PD requirement met, you would
Okay.
have to either submit a new waiver, if you still qualified, or you wouldn't qualify and they'd have to meet it.
So there could be a delay, but eventually we'll capture that opportunity again to get them in for
Yes.
that training.
And
Okay.
that's why I said it's sort of that implementation that we haven't made those procedures yet, but that's the plan.
Okay, thanks.
Board Member Flores.
Yes, so why go through this rigmarole when we know that 90 hours would really do the trick? And for and 45 hours is really nothing. I mean, it's just a taste. And so we need teachers that are really capable of working with second language learners. And they will be, if they're serious and they stay, they will be working with more second language learners. And so I think we should not give waivers of 45. It should be 90 hours, 90 clock hours. And then even more in later stages when they get a taste of it and see that they'll need more.
Board Member Flores, I can take that. The board actually, as a group, did ask us to put that provision into these rules.
Probably didn't vote for it, but.
So the reason the waiver option is in there is because you asked us to figure out a process for that. So, but I definitely appreciate the concerns there.
I have just a curious question
Board
on
Member
the.
Rankin?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Where did the 2% come from? Where did that number come from?
Oh, I thought you were raising your hand, Chair, to answer. Yes.
Finding the 2%?
Yes, that percentage came from conversations with the board as well as with experts in the field in trying to find that as an
that
option. Mm-hmm.
But you
Yes.
know, 2% in Denver would be thousands of kids. And when the law back in Lau versus Nichols, 1973, basically says that if you have, 16 or 17 kids per grade level, then you must provide, this or this or that. And there's a whole panoply of options of what kinds of programs you should provide. So 2% doesn't make sense I think we should just follow, federal law on that, because 2% is really misguiding. And in a large school district, 2% of 90,000 children.
Right.
Yeah,
So-
so, we have to go back, and 2% is meaningless. I'm sorry.
Madam Chair, I might be able to offer a little bit of clarification just on that front. This is only regarding an additional new professional development opportunity for teachers. The obligation of districts to meet their duties to English learner students under federal law, it remains the same under ELPA, remains the same, all that implementation, those students are getting those services. The question is for districts that have a percentage greater than 2% to give their teachers some additional tools for working with that population. I don't believe when we pulled the data and we're looking at that, what cut point might relieve the burden for some small districts without compromising services to students. Our large urban districts all are vastly over this number. This was really providing some relief primarily to districts far removed from our urban areas, small districts in the more rural parts of the state.
Thank you. Board Member Goff?
Thank you. This may be something about the details you've yet to meet on the road, but how is there an official notification process for the 2% mark? In other words, will the department let districts know that they are below the 2% requirement? Or will districts be expected to notify CDE? What's the official thing about that 2%, meeting that threshold one way or the other? Because with the possibility that a very small district, it would be logical for an assumption to be made that we know we have so few English language learners that it's obvious that we don't need to do a waiver, we don't need to go through any filing of any kind. I would just need some consistency of how all of this is applied. And no matter size of district, somebody's got to let somebody know what their status is on the 2% threshold.
Thank you for that question, Board Member Goff. So we haven't discussed implementation of any sort of formal notification that a district would be eligible for this waiver in particular, but the numbers do come from our annual pupil enrollment data collection, and so they do see those numbers, and that's done every year, so they would be aware of what their count is, but we haven't discussed formal notification that count would then make them eligible for this waiver. That's something we would need to discuss in implementation.
And even if, well, what is the opportunity for teachers to take advantage of any PD, even if their district is below the 2%? Is that option still available? And hopefully that would be part of the entire general communication plan on this.
Yeah, absolutely. This is, as I said before, even a superintendent may not choose to give this as a waiver to their educators. And we are working hard right now with entities to try to find lots of different options for educators to meet this requirement, whether they need to or not. As a reminder, this is only for current educators, and the requirements within the rules, of course, for all educators, will be met through preparation moving forward.
I just want to ask a question.
Go for it.
Thank you.
Board Member Flores.
So, I think if we had kind of a breakup of kids at each district, and were shown how many kids were in each category, I know that there's kind of pushback on this, but I think it's very important to know how many ESL kids we have in districts. If we knew that, certainly we would know we could average out the 2% or whatever. If we had data, I mean, just a little.
We have that. You look online for every school district.
Well, I think some people are having problems finding that information. And I know A+, talked to me this past week about not having that kind of data available as to how many kids were ESL. I don't know if it was specific to Denver, but I think we definitely need to. I've been saying this since I got here. So if we had that kind of stratified, then it would be easy to see whether, these kids made up 2% of that population or not.
Thank you, Board Member Flores. That's an important point, and just to clarify a little bit, all districts receive 100% of their data, and they have all of the ability to disaggregate and find exact pupil counts in every single disaggregated group. I think what A+ may be talking about is when we publicly report data, we have to apply some elements of data privacy to ensure that students can't be identified if there are small numbers in a certain district. And so in our public reporting on our website, we have some data suppression techniques that we're actually working on, but it's a data privacy element there. But all districts get 100% of their data and have all of that information at their fingertips.
And it's posted, right?
The data privacy elements that we post,
Right.
do
I
have
mean,
to
what's
suppress
protected is
some.
protected, but other than that, those numbers aren't posted.
I mean, we shouldn't
But
give.
you might not get 100% of the numbers, because if they're small,
Because,
they would
right,
be masked.
right.
But if names aren't given, and if a chart is provided,
Right. So that's a different conversation, so we can definitely sit down and talk about that.
thank you.
Further questions, comments?
So are we on then to the other issue?
Yes.
So I just wanted to ask, when I was looking at this letter from the East Central BOCES, that fourth paragraph, talking about how licensed teachers have 5 years to earn 45 clock hours of EL professional development, and alternative teachers are licensed teachers, but therefore should be under the same requirements. What is the response to that?
So we're coming to you today to get your clarity of what you'd like to do. I did have the chance to talk to the author of the letter just for my own clarity and making sure I really understood what they were asking. I really think there's two options here. for the requirements that have been put in, we have the preparation option, which is 90 clock hours or 6 credit hours for all people coming up through preparation right now. Then there's the teachers who are already teaching option of 45 clock hours for professional learning. Those are sort of the two pathways. Alternative prep, we do understand that they are in the unique position that they're sort of in both worlds. They are the preparation entity, but they're also currently teaching. So the question is, where should alternative prep candidates, those educators, land? And from this letter, they are advocating that they land in the professional learning of the 45 hours for those 5 identified groups. So the 5 years is probably a little complicated because it matters if your alt preparation is 1 year or 2 years. I think it would be cleaner to just say, instead of naming 5 years, are the alternative candidates considered a current teacher and fall under the 45 professional learning hours, and not worry, and they would fall under the same routine of the next full cycle. And we wouldn't really worry about the 5 years because it could be 7 or it could be 4. So, so I think that's the real question.
Okay, I'm not big on online learning, but I know it's useful. And in this case, if we had an online, and I'm sure 24 hours, which is what I think is expected of most people who get an ESL license. Isn't that the requirement, 24 hours now for anybody who, or is it 36? I mean, if they...
Are you talking about for the endorsement?
For the endorsement. So is it 24 hours for
Those
an
are-
endorsement?
Those are semester credit hours
Yes,
for the
semester
endorsement,
credit
and
hours.
the 45 and 90 we're discussing
Right.
are actually clock hours, so it's a
So,
little bit of a different calculation.
You know that there would be some people who really might want to do more than 45 hours. And at the very beginning, we started talking when we were discussing putting requirements for teachers who were going to work with ESL kids, that possibly, you know, they take the 24 hours, and then we whittled it down to 45 hours and 90 hours. But is it possible, and I think it is, that we could have the district, not the district, but CEA could have 24 hours of online program where people can avail themselves of courses if they want to do that online. And if we could go through, maybe not a university that's going to charge $25,000 or so, but make it easier for people who want to take more and more and want to be more proficient in working with this population, that they can avail themselves of you know, having more tools at their disposal where it doesn't cost them much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Just as
appreciate
an
that.
idea.
So I think just to clarify on this, the alternative preparation program and where you want that to sit, we did not, at the request of the board, make any changes to the last set of rules. And so right now it lists that prep programs, whether they are alternative or traditional prep programs, would need to embed 90 clock hours into their current program. So if you have a different opinion of that, then you would need to, now would be the time to tell us that, and we would alter the rules to reflect that.
So I think that's a better approach, only because these alternative licensure programs are so abbreviated because people are working full-time and teaching. So I think to ask them to add 90 hours is just difficult. And I think that they will get the same number of hours over time anyway, but it allows them to be treated like licensed teachers. I just think it's so much more doable, especially in rural areas where they're using a lot of alternative licensed teachers. teachers, I think it's a more doable approach. My suggestion.
So they get the other 45 hours on their renewal cycle.
Right.
Does everybody think that?
Yeah, I think it's cleaner.
Yeah,
I just
Cleaner?
think it's a lot cleaner
It's
and
less.
Consistent.
and it's a good way to start.
We're
And
into
as
less here.
we should remember, we can always adjust
We're in the list.
if we need to, after a reasonable amount of time to give everybody a start on it, but, yeah,
And so we might be able to come back next year, and if we see that, and it's not, I mean, it's set in stone for now, but we may come next year or the following year and say, well, we need more, especially if we're not seeing results on test scores and such. Ugh, I said that.
Board Member Durham.
Madam Chair, I'm sorry, and are we, Ms. Goff, were we referring to reducing from 90 to 45? Was that your comment, or did I?
Well, it's just based on the idea that we're treating alternative licensure programs, the teachers in them, as licensed teachers because they're teaching full-time. And then they're also in a university program. But it's very abbreviated since they're actually teaching. And so it gives them essentially more time to do the additional hours. But initially, it's the 45 clock hours. So it's treating them like a licensed teacher because they're
Well,
teaching.
Madam Chair, I objected to that change at the last meeting, and I'll continue to object to that change. I see no rationale for it being put in place, and I don't think that's a good exception to make. So I will, if that amendment's made, oppose it vigorously.
And you're opposing what?
Going from 90 to 45 hours.
So
Even
you
though
want to
they-
keep it at 90?
Yes.
So may I ask a question?
Yeah.
Even though they do get those hours, it's just that embedding it in the program, 90 up front, given the nature of the program itself. I mean, having sat in rooms with, professors and folks papering the walls with these standards, trying to fit in all the content in an abbreviated program and additional 90 hours, it's just very difficult to do if you're going to meet all the standards which programs are required to do. So it's kind of a logistical issue. The content is essential, but I think they get the content, they just have more time to get it. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I think I understand the argument, but I just don't happen to disagree, or I happen to disagree for a variety of reasons, and which we discuss at some point in time. But I don't, if this is good policy, and I'll have my own overall comments about that, if this is good policy, then, and 90 hours is the good policy, then that's the policy we ought to have. And there should be a better reason other than it's inconvenient for these people to get a 45-hour reduction, or get a reduction from 90 to 45. So no one has, I mean, I understand it's inconvenient, but getting back to the policy, if we support the policy, we support the policy. If we don't, we don't.
Dr. Sheffield,
Yeah.
I know that you're a terrific dean and professor. I know you are. And I know that you would, get these concepts and skills in, but I just don't know whether, getting it at the local level with these other institutions, whether 45 would do it. And, they have all this time to do it. And as we heard from these superintendents who came before us and said they were working for 4-day weeks, and that they could get that work done. And that's 60% of these small districts that are, they work 4 days a week. Kids go to school 4 days a week, and then teachers have an extra day. And I think that they could put that extra day to work in training. It's not that they're not going to have the time. So I think 90 hours is reasonable. In fact, I would go for more, but because
you won't get the support
but I would say 90 hours.
This just brings up the dilemma that we have with alternative prep programs. The critical need that we have for well-prepared teachers. They are learning a lot while they're learning in the classroom. The residency model is a strong model. If there's a mentor teacher who is really strong in this particular area, it might be okay. But if that person is also playing catch-up, there'd be just a significant weakness, and that's the dilemma we have. Board
And we're
Member Goff?
talking about 2 courses.
Board Member Goff?
What do we know? Is there any way to give a kind of a general overview of the alternative prep program content as far as this is concerned? I know, you know, we've got a lot of different institutions administering alternative prep, but I just wonder, boy, without upsetting a lot of apple carts, what are the possibilities that recommendations or guidelines could be issued about adjustment to content so as to address this topic? I spent a couple of years sort of in an oversight position for alternative ed candidates in Jefferson County several years ago. And for that district, it was one night a week where the seminar time was spent. It was required, everybody had to participate. It was considered coursework. And I know there were a lot of different topics addressed, and I'm sure the need is even greater these days than it was then. But I just wondered if there's a way we could look at what they have in their real, true course prep content on this idea, and how things like Dr. Flores thinking here around a 5th day in a 4-day district or whatever, how that could be thought about here, because I do not disagree that the more the better on this topic. There's so many aspects to it. I am just interested right now in being able to deliver a real clear, consistent message that all of our alternative prep programs will be able to understand quickly and easily, and keeps it on par in the practicality sense with regular 4-year programs. But you know, I'm willing to rethink this. Yeah, if I had my way, I'd say 90 hours, absolutely, because there's so many aspects to language acquisition, all of it. It's very complicated. And on the other hand, if there's already a way where folks are getting that orientation to and learning about, do we have to just add on credit or time for the sake of adding on equal numbers?
Right.
I'm not a fan of that either. So if that makes sense. If we have any idea about what the content of our alternative prep programs might be in general, but
I can try to answer
and I
that.
don't know whether it needs to be done now. I'd be interested.
It's a very short answer, actually. Yes, which is they, in state board rule, they align to the educator quality standards. So they have a minimum of 225 clock hours for those alternative programs, because as you described, they're teaching, and so things can be condensed compared to a traditional 4-year program. So this would just be embedded, this requirement would be embedded in as an additional requirement above meeting the content standards and the teacher quality standards. And that, again, it's written as a minimum of 225 clock hours for alternative licensure programs.
The standards would be added to the standards that are already being
Required.
required.
Yes.
So 90 hours should be minimum for,
All prep.
yes, 90 hours.
Well, it's not quite half the total credit hours, but that's a sizable amount. You know, and if there are other areas in that course of preparation course, there's just so many other things.
It's a great deal, yes.
Board Member Sheffield?
And I think it's a little bit, when you call the hours related to ELL learners, it's as though the title of the course needs to say that. And we know that in these courses, the standards cut across and are threaded through the courses. So for example, a course on differentiated instruction helps teachers tremendously in teaching EL learners.
Right.
But it's not called differentiating for EL learners, it's called differentiation. So I think that it's a little deceptive to say, well, they're not getting any of this, and so therefore you must have 90 hours. Actually, when you look at it, almost every course touches on it, because one size does not fit all for any child, and particularly for EL learners. So that's why I was thinking, if we could treat them like licensed teachers, since they're actually teaching and they're responsible for a classroom, they need these 45 clock hours, and eventually they get the remainder of the hours. But this allows the program to be as, it fits the model better, because the model is fewer hours in the classroom, more hours in the field, which actually research suggests is
But I think-
more effective,
but
because
I
they're in the
think-
classroom faster.
But if we, in a reductionist mode that we're in right now, I think we need language and culture, which would be probably that course that you're talking about. And then you would need to teach skills in teaching English as a second language. So that is very important in itself. And then you have the differentiated, one, which is another 6 hours, but you need the two. And I think,
So can I get a question?
I'm sorry?
I'd like to get in a question before we keep going on this, because now I'm not sure I understand. You're not talking about changing the number of hours that are a part of an alternative prep program. You're talking about adding the standards to the standards that are already required. Or
Yes.
did I get that wrong? So I'm trying to figure out, what does the 90 hours actually mean?
Yes, it would be that requirement to the alternative programs, just like the traditional, will have to show how those hours are being met with, as Dr. Sheffield described, it could be already courses. Integrated, or if they don't have those, then what are they adding to their program to meet that requirement?
So
they'll
it's
have
not
to show-
necessarily adding hours to the program.
It could be, it matters what their current content is. As a reminder, we have over 30 alternative programs. 10 of those are institutes of higher ed that have both traditional and alternative programs. So their alternative programs look a little different than, say, the 10 programs that are in our BOCES and things like that. So there's a gamut of how content is provided.
Yeah, so we're spending a lot of time talking about hours, when we really
Well,
should be
I'm
talking
thinking
about
about
content and.
Well, I'm giving you two
standards.
the content, I think that's very important.
But that's
And
not our,
a
that,
skill-
that,
That's a skills level.
Got it.
And then there's the language and culture component and how they,
Right. Thanks for the lecture.
those are very important.
Do we understand that? Because I think that's sort of thrown me off a bit. When you have 45 hours, what does that look like in this discussion in terms of the content versus the 90 hours? Right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's.
It's probably just depth, right? I mean, so it's still hitting the 3 same categories. But the requirement not only is the number of hours, but also if they're treated as current teachers, as has been advocated for through this letter, it would also impact who takes those versus the 5 identified areas, which are current educators, versus in preparation, it's all. So that's another consideration.
Board Member Goff?
At the risk of complicating, what our discussion is right now is focused on classroom teachers, correct?
Yes.
Did this conversation come up anywhere on the administrator level, building principals?
That was
As well?
discussed in the working group, yes, but the recommendation has come forward with the 5 identified areas, which is elementary, math, science, social studies, and English language arts.
Okay, well, maybe I'm not phrasing that well. I'm just curious as to whether there's conversation about this general requirement for ELL training or professional development on the part of building principals, or other administrative leader, instructional leaders, if that conversation came up at all.
It did in the working group, but
Okay,
it did not
okay.
come forward to you.
But not through
as-
at this.
Yes.
right. So some other day we talk about it.
Board Member Shell.
Could you, Mary, walk us through an example? Let's say we decide that alternative licensed teachers in alternative license programs are not treated as licensed teachers, and they need the 90 hours. What will happen when that passes? Tell us an example of the implications.
Sure. So we will have to reach out to our 30-plus teacher prep, alternative prep programs. We will ask them to identify for us how they'll be meeting this requirement and submit that to us. And we'll have to set a time frame for, do we start with candidates, September 1, et cetera. Many of the programs, alternative programs for teacher, are either 1 year or 2 years. So if they're a 1-year program, they will have to tell us how they're still meeting all the other requirements and embedded these within that 1-year program, or for the ones that are 2-year programs within their 2-year program.
I think. Board Member Rankin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think we've taken a really interesting look at a complicated problem and made it even more complicated.
That's my feeling.
So,
Either
let
that
me
or we
just-
understand it finally.
let me just ask another complicated question. Dr. Sheffel talked about embedding some of this in already existing. How can you determine an already existing course with a percentage of that course dedicated to this at one school? It might be 10% of that course it is embedded. And how many credit hours would that be, or clock hours, compared to another course at another alternative educator course at another college that maybe 50%? How do we weight that? And are we taking a situation, it sounds to me like we're getting so down deep in the process, what are the outcomes? Are these really helping the kids, or are we just doing this to say, okay, now we have this? And what difference, or do we have a measurable difference? Or are some colleges going to put out teachers that are better trained than others? I'm not quite sure of this complicated issue, and I'm not sure I could vote on it intelligently today at this point. If anyone can help me with this, I would appreciate it.
So Board Member Rankin, I'll try. I think you're right. We've been grappling with this issue for a couple years now, actually, just based on some inquiries and such that we've gotten. We've tried to strike a balance, right? So I think originally when we came to you, almost probably over a year ago, a year and a half ago maybe, to respond to some federal inquiries we've had, Department of Justice inquiries we've had. We had a set of recommendations that were pretty robust and for all, and even probably more hours and requirements, included principals, all those things. We worked with the field. We heard a lot of feedback from the field. We heard a lot of feedback from you all. And we've been working the process for about a year and a half now to figure out what's an appropriate balance that we can strike to get started on this and to get started on providing some additional professional development for teachers and embedding a few more of those strategies and skills into preparation programs and alternative preparation programs. And so, this is where we've landed. It becomes complicated because of some of those questions you have. There's different ways to do this. You can measure embedding strategies by hours, or as Dr. Sheffel said, a lot of these skills and strategies are already embedded throughout the curriculum. So those are complexities that we're going to have to figure out. And I'll just be honest and transparent, there's not a perfect way to measure that, right? So we've sort of put this proposal in front of you as our best option based on all the feedback we've heard, based on the sort of compromises that we've made throughout the process, and this is sort of where we sit now. I wouldn't say that any of us would think it was perfect, but starting somewhere and getting some additional attention on the matter is a good start.
I just want to remind us, and then I'll get to you. I just want to remind us that what we did tell staff was that we were really concerned about putting a lot of burdens on teachers in their renewal process. But we had much stronger feelings about being upfront, about the upfront process, the prep process, saying that we wanted our teachers to be getting those skills, that information, that curriculum at the front end, rather than being stronger in the professional development piece. And I think that's probably what you all heard from us. Board member, I just want to remind ourselves of that. Board member.
Have we, and I'm sure you did, but if you could just highlight other states and what they're doing? Does this seem more or less
Much less.
than what other states are doing?
Yeah, I apologize, I didn't bring all that information that we presented in the original. That'd be something I'd have to go back to.
It is much less.
I will say,
12, 18 hours.
For some other states that are doing this statewide, there is a stronger requirement, I would say.
Than the 90?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Oh.
In some, and I don't know, that's not a broad
That's what I
swath.
don't have. I don't have the specifics.
I wasn't looking for
Yeah,
specifics.
but
I was
some,
just looking
absolutely.
for
Well, working in
a
other-
general weight of where the state, where we would fall if we or did 90. And am I correct in understanding that we are supposed to determine 90 or 45 that we will be voting on today? Or is this, is what you have here, testimony at the May public 90 clock hours for educator preparation revised? Is this what we're voting on today, the revised, the
Thank you
revision?
for that clarification, because we,
Can I-
yeah.
Just a minute, just one moment, Dan.
Yes, so to answer that, in rule, we have it listed as 90
Yes.
for all preparation programs, alt and traditional, and we have it written as 45 for current teachers in professional learning before their next. That's what's in rule that is in front of you in
Mhm.
red line. The question we brought before you was, did you want to alter for alternative licensure, and as this letter to you suggested, move them out of preparation and over into the professional learning.
Okay. Thank you. For
You're
that.
welcome.
That helps.
Go ahead.
What if we left 90 and then asked teachers to take the Proxys test for the ESL? If they can pass the Proxys test in ESL, then they don't have to take the 90 hours. They pass. So English, and if they've been working at it for a while, I mean, why can't they just pass the Proxys test?
Yes.
In ESL?
Do you want an answer? Board member Schaffel?
Well, my thought would be, we know that teaching is a practice, and teachers get good at it by being in the classroom, and one can pass tests, even pass classes, and have a wonderful GPA, and maybe not really know how to teach. So I
Well,
think,
but that would be a lot, the Praxis is not an easy, I mean, that goes into
well,
skills.
they
and
have to
asks-
pass it in
They'd
an
have to
alternative
pass a Praxis.
program anyway.
Or
But-
90.
Well, no, everybody has 90. The 45 only refers to renewal. So as you point out, we have in rule that teachers in preparation require 90 hours of
Right.
preparation.
In a-
It's
in
only
a
the
regular-
45
I'm
for
even
renewal.
giving-
And the question is, how do we treat alternative licensed teachers? As teachers or as initially being prepared? That's the question. That's all. But it's just the question is does it make sense to require these programs to put more in?
Yeah, but
to
the
the
Praxis has a
alternative
lot of
Board Member
information
Durham.
that they would know.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I think it's important to remember how we got here, and this has been a couple of year-long process at this point. And unfortunately, we're dealing with the heavy hand of the federal government in being trying to micromanage what we do, and I put that squarely on Secretary DeVos for failure to remedy this problem. That one of the things we should have received from this administration is allowing states to manage their own futures. Unfortunately, we haven't gotten that. So we're stuck with this, and I think if you'll all remember, I did what I think was a pretty good opportunity cost, as well as an actual out-of-pocket cost, to if this were to be implemented for all 100,000 licensed teachers, which is where we started, for I think at least 90 hours, it might have been more. And frankly, by the time you run the opportunity cost on that at the average salary of the average teacher in the state of Colorado and reduce that to an hourly rate, you get to about $800 million. And we've got all the world whining about not enough money in education. Yet we're going to, while it's not an actual out-of-pocket cost we were about to impose on the state, opportunity costs are just as real. And they are just as real, particularly when you evaluate the fact that we have a shortage and people are leaving the profession in significant numbers. And if we're going to force them to take something, a class that they feel is of no value to them, and they're going to, instead of being able to take something they think of as is important, like content strengthening or something else, there are trade-offs. There are only so many hours, there's only so much money, there's only so much time. So you do have to value the opportunity cost. So even where this thing is today, make no mistake, this is putting at least a $200 million opportunity cost on today's teachers. Now, you all might be okay with that. And we frankly don't have a lot of choice because of the lack of relief that we have received from this administration. So that's the reality we're going to face. So, but you can't, when you think about increasing something, just pick a number, because it's not nickels and dimes. It's real money, both out pocket and opportunity cost. Every teacher in the state, all of whom apparently think they're underpaid. So you can't. We don't live in a world where we just go, let's all do this. This is a requirement. It's not being put forward as a good idea. This is a requirement, and I think and I want to give staff and Dr. Anthus and Dr. Pearson they did a good job in trying to balance the various interests. Now, I still am very likely to be a no vote, because even as balanced as this has become, you just can't escape what we are doing, and actually it's not us, what the federal government is doing to solve a problem that, frankly, if you left it to the districts and you left it to the local people to solve their own problem, they do a better job than the federal government's doing, and they do a better job than we're doing. But we don't live in that perfect world. We live in a world where we're going to be required to do something, and this may be as good as it gets. But every time you talk about making it more, just if you go from 45 to 90 hours, you're talking at least a couple $100 million in opportunity and out-pocket costs. So we shouldn't all sit up here and think we're doing a great thing. Maybe it is great, but it isn't free. There's an enormous cost to this. I wouldn't be a bit surprised if it leads to additional retirements of teachers, people who just have had enough of somebody micromanaging how they do their job. And if they apparently feel disrespected, well, in some ways I don't blame them, because obviously we don't have enough confidence in them to do what's appropriate for their students, or we're going to make them. So we're not treating them like professionals. We're treating them like plumbers. And there may be a societal good from this. Dr. Flores, I don't doubt that there could be a societal good for this. But let's not presume that these societal goods are free. They're enormously expensive.
Right.
And they're enormously expensive in a state that at least it is perceived doesn't have enough resources dedicated to this problem already. So,
And I know that rural districts are lacking, but I was under the understanding when we had those, that group of superintendents before us, that they would agree, that they agreed that they could get it done. Now, as far as the monies, I think the question I asked, could you do it if it were free? Free, I mean, we talked about free a lot. Free meaning that teachers would not have the cost on those courses added to out of their pocket. This was the district doing it, this was the state helping in getting that done. So, I mean, we went from free to getting it done. Could you do it? Yes, they could. Now, we have to come up with that money. In fact, you're just bringing something up that, about the cost that I thought had already been equaled in. We had already thought about that, and that it wasn't teachers, it wasn't gonna come out of the teachers' pockets. So, and I know a lot of money comes out of teachers' pockets, and so I understand, but we need to do something here. Either ask the legislature or ask the feds. I mean, the feds should have just put out that money if they required, that teachers to do it. And I know that the feds are penny pinching right now, and
So I'm gonna ask Ms. McClellan to get a motion on the floor, and then we will continue our discussion, if that's okay. Because we're supposed to have a motion on the floor and then talk.
oh, okay.
So I'll go ahead and make the motion in the interest of providing a little structure and keeping us moving. I move to approve the rules for the Colorado Educator Licensing Act of 1991, 1 CCR 301-37.
That's a
And
proper
this
motion.
is,
Is there,
and this
it's a
would be,
proper motion. Do I have a second?
how many hours would that be?
Could I have a second, and then we can talk about this?
Well,
This is
wanna
the
know what we're
unamended.
voting
If
on.
you want to
This
do
is
an
the
amendment
unamended.
later, that's another matter, but this is the
Yes.
unamended 90 hours. So that's just to get us started so that we can
Okay.
have structure. So
I
do we have a second?
90 hours.
Thank you. And then I have a clarifying question, if I may. As we examine whether or not to entertain a motion to amend to 45 hours for those that are teaching in an alternative licensure, alternative licensure preparation program, my question is and I feel like you may have covered this in past presentations, so I apologize for not having this off the top of my head, but approximately what proportion of Colorado teachers are we talking about that are teaching in a program that would be impacted by that by that reduction from 90 to 45?
So last year we had approximately 800 alternative licenses going. Now that doesn't mean 800 because some programs are 2 years. So we're talking several hundred. Again, if they were moved out of the prep requirement and into the I'm a teacher requirement for the professional learning, it would possibly reduce that even a little bit more because it would be those 5 identified areas. Right. So, for instance, some of the other alternative candidates aren't in those 5 areas. So we're talking approximately, I'd say, about 400, 500 educators.
That's helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Board Member Sheffield, did I say you have another comment?
I just had another question for Mary. Mary, when you said that alternative licensure programs have about 200 and some hours, what was that factoid?
It's the minimum is 225
So
hours.
that's clock hours.
Correct.
And then that resolves into credit hours, right? And so you divide by 15 and you get how many courses roughly in an alternative licensure program?
Again, at the traditional,
Right.
the 10 institutes of higher ed who have all
Right.
turned those into
Credit hour
credit
classes.
hours.
So is it
We
about-
don't require that. We don't have that information.
No, but is it about 10 classes or you don't know?
Yeah, that would be
Roughly about 10.
Yeah, roughly.
Next question.
12.
Madam Chair, I do just want to, our team had a few other things that would be a part of this vote, that they should just briefly go over
We had
quickly.
paused for the conversation around 90-45. We had a couple more items.
Go for
So
it.
These
Any
are
more
the
questions besides, I know that Mr. Durham has one, he'll be right back, so please go ahead, and then we'll catch him.
These are just the technical alignments to recently passed legislation. So in order to align with SB 18160, we've added language to acknowledge the ability of charter schools and the Charter School Institute to operate educator induction and alternative educator preparation programs, and to align with HB 1030 and HB 181095, which address out-of-state and military spouse candidates respectively. The amount of the number of years experience required for those candidates has been changed to 3 out of the past 7, whereas before it was 3 consecutive years of experience. So just wanted to make sure you're aware those are part of this as well.
Can we do it separately?
These are all embedded. We've gone over all the changes that are embedded in CCR 30137. So all the way back from the definition, removing the definition of core and naming those 5, clarity that it's a one-time requirement, the ability for superintendents and charter school principals, CSA charter school principals, to submit the waiver, and then the question around at what's in front of you in the red line version is the 90 clock hours for all educator prep programs, including alternative.
Did you have some changes you wanted to make to the motion, some amendments do you want to make to the motion?
I just want to keep it at 90 hours.
Board Member Durham, I believe you have a question.
Well, it wasn't really a question, it's just I think if there's one word that we need to remove from our lexicon in government generally is free. There is no free. There's a cost attached to, even if these programs, even if these courses can be provided for nothing to the teachers, there's still an enormous cost to them.
That's true.
And so
It's time.
And time is perhaps the most valuable asset any of us have.
I agree.
So, at any rate, I'd like to request a 5-minute recess, Madam Chair.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you.
For all of us?
Yeah, from
Guys, keep it at 5 minutes because we are a little risky here. Guess we're not. Ms. Cordial?
You ready to step in?
Go ahead, Ms. Bloom. It's just the alphabet.
The motion.
Courage is good.
Yeah. Get you killed.
Yeah.
We're waiting for you to call the vote.
Oh,
No, I-
okay. Did we make any amendments?
Nope.
Okay.
No.
No, I'm.
I asked. I asked.
Do you wanna?
You-
Board Member Durham.
And the motion is on the,
90.
is that the motion?
Yes, sir.
Is it on an amendment?
There is
There's
no
no
amendment.
amendment.
No, no.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no.
Board Member Flores.
Yes.
Board Member Goff.
No.
Board Member McClellan.
Yes.
Board Member Rankin.
No.
Board Member Shuffle.
No.
Board Member Schroeder.
Yes.
The motion
Fails,
fails.
so let's get going, guys, please. There's an amendment you want? We've got to pass these rules. We can't put this off.
Come on, Steve, you were 90.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I think we needed to vote on the amendment first,
There wasn't one. Nobody made one. I'm just
She
suggesting.
made one.
but we can't go.
No, I made an underlying motion.
What
What
was
is
it?
that?
I made the suggested underlying motion. It was never amended, and it was voted down.
I'll make a motion.
I'm sorry.
Board Member Goff, what's your amendment?
Could you read the, no, I'm at a point of order here. I'd like to know, could you read the motion we voted on?
Sure. The motion that I made was, I move to approve the rules for the Colorado Educator Licensing Act of 1991, 1 CCR 301-37.
Good. We're done.
No, we're not done. We've got to find some way to approve these rules.
Procedurally, we're done.
No.
Is
Oh,
this
yes,
what-
we are.
Is this what you want?
Madam Chair,
Well,
I.
I'm just talking to the folks who voted no.
Here's my understanding, what we just voted on is the motion to adopt the current rules as presented.
Right.
Is that not what we just did?
In the current.
voted them
And
down.
the result is?
We don't have any rules. So are there some alternative, some
So we're,
amendments?
okay,
or
so
are
we
just
voted
not
down
going to
90
have-
hours.
Madam
I know
Chair,
where you are,
I'm
Steve. It's
confused.
okay.
I'd like to have a short recess.
No, we can't do that anymore. And you know what? We don't belong back there. We
Well,
belong
I'm-
out here to
tell
talk
you what,
about these things.
I'm going to move for a short recess and pursuant to Robert's Rules of Order, demand a roll call vote. It's not debatable and it has to be voted on. And I move we recess for 5 minutes. And I'll cite the rule if anybody has any doubt
That's
about it.
okay. Let's vote on it.
Board Member Durham.
Yes.
Board Member Flores.
Yes.
Board Member Goff.
Yes.
Board Member McClellan.
No.
Board Member Rankin.
Yes.
Board Member Shuffle.
Yes.
Board Member Schroeder.
No. So let's go have another illegal meeting back here.
Let's have ours in there, too.
No, I don't do that. Durham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Having voted on the prevailing side, I move for immediate reconsideration of the previous motion to adopt the teacher licensure rules.
So you want to go back to the original motion that was made by Board Member McClellan? To reopen?
Right, for reconsideration of that. So if this motion passes, then we'll be, if the motion reconsidered passes, then that'll be back in front of us and subject to amendment.
Do we have to do that?
That is.
Mhm.
Bob? Okay,
Yeah.
We have to vote on the reconsideration.
got it.
Right.
Board Member,
Does he need a second?
Mrs. Cordial. Oh, we need a second.
And not
Yeah.
actually.
Second.
Wait, did she vote, does the second have to have voted on the prevailing side?
No.
May I ask a clarifying question? Are we
Go right
voting
ahead.
to reconsider or
Yes.
voting to
Yes.
re-vote?
Just to open it back up.
Just to reopen?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Please.
Okay. Board Member Durham.
Yes.
Board Member Flores.
Yes.
Board Member Goff.
Yes.
Board Member McClellan.
Yes.
Board Member Rankin.
Yes.
Board Member Shuffle.
Yes.
Board Member Schroeder.
Yes. So we're going to reconsider.
we're
Do
gonna
I have a
reconsider.
motion?
You have a motion now on the floor, which is the original motion. Is there, I think the question is, are there amendments to that motion?
Do we have an amendment?
Yes. Are you?
I move the requirement for educator preparation programs be revised to reflect 45 clock hours for alternative licensure program candidates over 5 years.
It's a proper motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Should we vote on the amendment? We vote on the amendment first, right?
Correct.
Board Member Durham.
No.
Board Member Flores.
No.
Board Member Goff.
No.
Board Member McClellan.
No.
Board Member Rankin.
Yes.
Board Member Shuffle.
Yes.
Board Member Schroeder.
No.
That motion fails. 5-2. Or 2-5, sorry.
So it's 90.
No, we do not have,
We
we
don't
have
have
not
maybe?
passed anything yet.
Yeah, now we're back to the original motion, so
You want to try again?
call the question. Okay.
Does anybody want to make a motion?
It's already on
It's
the
already on the
floor.
floor.
Oh, it is on the floor?
It's on the floor.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And there's a second?
Yes.
Call the vote, please.
Board Member Durham.
No.
Board Member Flores.
No.
What?
No, we,
Come on, Val.
Yes, you're a yes.
You're a yes.
You want to be a yes.
okay.
Shoot me.
No, but
You want 90
I'm
hours or
confused.
not?
I want 9 hours.
Yes.
Then you're a
Then
yes.
it's
Then
a
you're a
yes.
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 Back to the original. Board Member Goff.
Yes.
Board Member McClellan.
Yes.
Board Member Rankin.
No.
Board Member Shuffle.
No.
Board Member Schroeder.
Yes.
That motion passes. 4-3.
Good.
We had a robust discussion and struggle. And as I said previously, I think this sort of reflects the concerns we have about alternative prep and the significance of teacher preparation. Prep. Next item on our agenda is consideration of the rules for the administration of educator licensure endorsement. 1 CCR 301-101. I ask that staff give a brief presentation before I take a motion. Commissioner?
Thank you. I'll turn it back to our lovely staff members, Mary Ann Johnson.
Thank you, Dr. Anthus. Thank you, Madam Chair. Just got moved around. As a reminder, the proposed revisions to this package, which is 1 CCR 301-101, included the addition of a middle school math endorsement, expanded school nurse pathways, and expanded school counselor pathways. No additional written or public comment was received regarding the middle school math endorsement or the expanded school nurse endorsement. You heard public testimony and received written comment at the May hearing regarding the expanded school counselor pathway. Additional written comments were received after that public hearing, and those comments were similar to those previously received and heard at the public hearing, and those comments were in opposition to the expanded school counselor endorsement pathway. And you have received all of those written comments that were received since that hearing. Yes, you have. At that May meeting, the board directed CDE staff to investigate the following pieces of information, which included the ratio of school counselors to students in Colorado, national trends related to the school counselor shortage, and the estimated time that counselors spend on career and tech planning. You see here before you the response to the request about the ratios of school counselors. You can see that statewide, the number of students to school counselors in Colorado is 456 to 1. This comes from our annual Human Resources and Student October pupil enrollment collection that we do. In regard to national trends, we were able to pull information from the National Center for Education Statistics. The most recent year of data available from that data source was the 2015-16 school year. So you'll see a number from Colorado here that's slightly different to the one that we were able to provide from our most recent data that we collect here at CDE. But you'll see that those ratios can vary from 903 to 1, such as in Arizona, and 195 to 1 in Vermont. Colorado was on the lower end with 376 at that time. Again, it's now 456 at 1 to 1. We are not able to identify any notable state-initiated strategies to address school counselor shortages. On this next slide, you can see what the role of school counselors is as directed in their master's programs, in their preparation programs, and also recommendations from the association, the American School Counselor Association, in regard to how they spend their time. CDE staff are not recommending any additional changes to this part of the rules at this time, and at this time I'd like to open it up for any discussion or questions about the expanded school counselor pathway or middle school math endorsement or school nurse endorsement.
Would it be possible for us to have a motion on the floor and then have our discussion?
I move to approve the rules for the administration of educator licensure endorsements 1 CCR 301-101.
Get
Second.
the proper motion. Thank you. Discussion, questions? Thank you for the additional information. I'm a little flummoxed why there's such a big difference between our source of the ratio and the national data.
For clarification, it's just the different years of data.
Oh,
The
different
first
years
slide
of
I
data.
showed you
I
was,
didn't hear
yes,
that.
different years of data. So the first slide I
Apologies.
showed you was from the 17-18 school year, and then from the National Center for Education Statistics, that was 15-16. So it's just changed over time.
It got that much worse in 2 years after we added the counselor, the extra counselor in every district? Whoa. Doesn't make sense, does it?
Well, we didn't have enough to begin with.
Didn't we add counselors?
We have a counselor grant program, but
Yeah.
it doesn't mean that we added it across. If a district requested a grant, then they may have gotten to add a few. But in general, that's a fairly small scale program when you look at the overall numbers.
I was overly optimistic that we had added counselors and decreased the ratio over time. Board Member Goff?
Since last month, I would assume that you all have gotten a lot of the same feedback that we have, especially in the concerns around the different nature of the two jobs that a professional counselor job and description and responsibilities and legal things about that work are very different from school counselors. I know that public comment period having ended, I just wonder if there's been some further conversation, creative ideas about how to do a number of things. One of them, alleviate our shortage a little bit, or do more embedded recruitment efforts, ideas for that, in order to try to honor the concerns people have about combining these two jobs, or that's not even quite right, but having a set of expectations on a licensed personal counselor that is really quite diverse and different from what is required of a school counselor in the areas of dealing with career development and planning and just the school environment versus an individual counseling session. We had comment was presented yesterday on that from a former national officer with the American School Counselor Association, and currently is a professor of counseling in Colorado. So I don't know whether there's an answer to that. I'd just be curious if there's been some further conversation, even among counselors themselves, as to how to start addressing this in such a way as to avoid, whenever we can, any melding of jobs that may end up being a little bit, we may have unintended consequences if we do that. So just curious about that. If there's an answer, that's great. If not, I understand.
We have heard some ideas for supporting induction programs for those counselors, but we don't yet know the details of what would be feasible for implementation.
Do we have the capacity
Yeah.
to help districts with that induction?
I don't know. I think we'd have to look into that. I don't know right now.
We certainly could get support districts who wanted, who were taking on this role, which is, as you remember, we brought this forward based on the amount of emergency licenses that have been coming forward, and that we had these clinical counselors in buildings now. And when they ask for those emergency licenses, that's some of what they share with us, is we're going to support this person and through their induction program. So we could continue to find resources and provide those to the districts who, utilize this as an option.
So at the risk of having Board Member Durham jump down my throat, I realize there's an opportunity cost in training and providing adequate training for clinical psychologists to become counselors. But in the same manner that we are looking at helping for our second language learner teachers to achieve certain levels of skills where we believe we can provide some free courses. I mean, I realize you haven't gone through the development of that whole program, but something similar to that, maybe certainly not the numbers, but some kind of support that we could offer, either online or with a grant, or should we go to the legislature to ask that? Should we be using those counselor grants that we already have in order to have some sort of an induction program developed? Just something to make this work well for schools and kids.
I know Board Member Durham has a point, but we can ask Misty Ruthven to come up. She manages more of the counselor side of this, and so if you'd like to have more discussion about that, she can come up, but Board Member Durham, I know him.
He's going to jump down my throat.
No, I'm not. Thank you, Madam Chair. This is actually something that works in the other direction, and while it isn't free, it will be less expensive than the alternative. I think it's unusual for this board to face what the legislature faces on a very regular basis, which is a turf fight between various professional groups and trying to define scope of practice. It's really, and I wouldn't be surprised if the group that doesn't prevail will go over to the legislature and ask for a bill to essentially overturn this decision and restrict the available supply of counselors in schools, and we'll be back to approving one-on-one a lot of temporary licenses. I think the chair's idea on this is an excellent one, that we could probably at low cost develop a way to take advantage of a very well-trained, highly professional pool of individuals who I think are already, at least in my own personal view, are already qualified to do this job, but to the extent that they might need some additional work or some additional training, there's a way to get it at a much lower cost than there is to simply require everybody to go through all of the very significant training that it would require to go from one category of professional licensure to another. So I think the chair's idea is an excellent one, and I think we should support the rules as written. And if the legislature wishes to referee this turf war, that's entirely up to them.
I thought we should ask them for money.
Well, and
Training.
that might be a very good solution. That it would certainly be less expensive than than refereeing the turf war in favor of the one group. So I hope we'll vote for the rules as stated.
Misty, I'm sorry, I cannot pronounce your last name.
It's all
I'm sorry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, all. So my name is Misty Ruthven, Executive Director of Student Pathways. As many of you are aware, the School Counselor Corps grant and other related work is in the Division of Student Pathways. So essentially, the conversation that I just wanted to nuance a little bit and clarify some of the information that you've heard today about counselors is over the past 5 years, we've seen fairly significant decreases in ratios from both the National Education Statistics data and the data that we have here in Colorado, as well as the American School Counseling Association data. About 5 years ago, we were at 500 to 1 for the student to counselor ratio. And today, as you've heard, we're at in the high 300s to 1, right? 376, 383. Apples to apples, it's pretty darn close. So with that, I think you brought up some great points today and things that are related to conversations that are ongoing within the School Counselor Corps grant is how do we help leverage the trainings that are offered through that grant to all. So there's a series of webinars that have been offered around college and career readiness. As you know, that's specifically focused on the academic preparation and the college and career counseling piece of that. Potentially, if the legislature and you all wanted us to expand some of that with some additional low-cost funding, that could be possible. One of the things that we've heard from other states who are doing similar transitions, right, between other professions and folks in similar professions that are transitioning to school counselors, is that then they have a robust induction program as part of that pivoting, right, piece. And in some other states, that's done by the state education department, and in some other states, it's done by the school counselor professional organization at a low cost for the state. So some additional information that might be helpful to you.
Thank you. Do we have a statewide school counselor association?
We do.
That's who commented yesterday.
I just wanted to make
Flew
sure.
right by me, sorry, who she was representing. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to draw in the red line that there is language about the induction
Yes.
program. So I just want, in case
Thank you.
people didn't know that it is listed in there.
Thank you. Ready for a vote, colleagues?
Board Member Durham?
Yes.
Board Member Flores?
Yes.
Board Member Goff?
Yes.
Board Member McClellan?
Yes.
Board Member Rinkin?
Yes.
Board Member Shuffle?
Yes.
Board Member Schroeder?
Yes.
Thank you. That passes unanimously.
Thank you very much. Please pass on our appreciations to everyone except Colleen for not being here. I hope
Thank
she's
you.
having a wonderful vacation.
Madam Chair, quickly, if
She
it's all
needs
right,
it.
as a result of that vote, we do have a brief information item, just that's related to that vote, if that's all right if we go over that?
Of course.
Okay, thank you. So procedurally, with the adoption of any new endorsement, and in this case today you passed the addition of a middle school mathematics endorsement, teachers need to show their content knowledge in order to obtain that endorsement. One way to do that is through an exam. And so as a result of the addition of that endorsement today, the board would need to adopt an exam. And so we will at a future meeting bring information to you about that. You have a little background here that currently ETS Praxis are the statewide currently adopted statewide assessments for our educator endorsements right now. CDE staff has conducted a preliminary review of the Praxis Middle School Math, that's test number 5169, and further review of that assessment and any available will be conducted, and we'll bring an action item before you at a future meeting.
But
Yeah,
this,
probably the sooner the better for those endorsements, right?
Yeah, we're
Our plan
planning
is
for the
August.
August meeting.
so
Well,
this
then-
would be your information item on
Correct.
this. As
Oh,
for
because of my
August.
rule? Okay.
Exactly, because, Madam Chair, because of your rule, it's a good rule. This is your information item, and we can certainly schedule meetings with staff if you have questions about this. We have 2 months to schedule those meetings, so plenty of time to get any of your questions answered about the middle school math content assessment. And then we would ask for a vote in August.
Are we informed? Everybody informed? Thank you very much.
Well,
Thank you.
we have the proxies for math. Why not have the proxies for ESL? And if they could pass it, that
I'm
would be the
so surprised to hear you
place.
talking about enjoying assessments.
What?
Somehow this just doesn't
I know.
jive with, never mind, please. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's
very
a
much.
knowledge
Off the hot
base. I think it's a good idea.
I was gonna ask if there had been a Mellow sighting, but that's only because she's hiding.
Thank you.
I don't know where.
Welcome. You're looking rested. You're looking relaxed.
Thank you. I do feel a bit more rested than the last time I was before you all. And I promise Melissa and I did not call each other this morning to coordinate our
Well,
outfits.
you're both lovely.
So we seem to have done a nice job of that.
Excellent. So the next item on the agenda is the 2018 end of session report and legislative implementation.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to turn this over to Jennifer Mello and Melissa Bloom.
Well, that's quite an introduction.
I'm
Thanks.
sorry, it's
I'm
the
teasing.
second half of the second
I
day.
totally get it. It
But
is.
you guys look wonderful and coordinated, so thank you.
We really should have talked about this to not do this, but it is lovely to
And
see you all.
springy, even though it is summer.
Yes, I know it is summer. So we are going to focus today on implementation issues, right? So we go through the whole legislative process, bills get proposed, they don't all pass, a bunch of them do, and then that creates opportunities for work. I was about to say work, but I changed it to opportunities for work. I don't know if that's any better. For you all as a board, primarily in the rulemaking process, and also for department and staff. So the focus of today is really where do we go from here? We have all this stuff that happened. We're going to tell you what happened and tell you how the department's working to start implementing it. That being said, as you all know, I don't actually do the implementation work. So I have some level of knowledge on this. We've got some folks in the room who can help us. We have detailed questions. But Melissa Bloom has been very connected to this work throughout the legislative process. She does a great deal to help us coordinate fiscal notes and all kinds of this components. So she's been a critical part of this, and she may have more details. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to her to get started. And is it okay? It's up there. Great.
So I know you all heard Katie mention yesterday a few of these sort of broader statistics on the legislative session. But legislators introduced approximately 71 education-related bills. 45 of these bills passed, 26 failed. Katie also mentioned our work on fiscal notes. We responded to 134 fiscal note requests from Legislative Council this year. And then getting into more of what we'll talk about today, there are 41 bills that we've identified as CDE staff that will require implementation on behalf of CDE and the State Board. And that's really what we'll be digging into today. Specifically, we're going to dig into kind of 10 of those that are more significant in detail. And we'll still put up the other bills, and if you have questions on them, we're happy to answer. But we figured we'd focus on the ones with the biggest lift today. Also, just to note, thanks to a lot of Jennifer's wonderful work this session, all 13 of the bills that you all supported as a state board did pass this year. There was one bill that the state board opposed that did pass. However, it was amended significantly throughout the session to kind of alleviate some of those concerns. And we'll discuss that also as we get into some of those more detailed bills. So as I mentioned, there are 10 bills that we will kind of go over of those 41 today, kind of in more detail. If you have questions as we go through them, feel free to ask. And as we get into past those 10 bills, if there are additional ones, we're going to go through them sort of in an order where that will they require the most work or the most significant policy changes. So hopefully we'll get some of those bigger bills up front. If you have additional questions, I'll turn it back over to Ms. Olive.
And let me just pause there real quick to see if there's any questions at this point about what we're here, what we're doing, what we're trying to do here. Okay, seeing none, we'll dive into it. So the first bill to talk about is a bill that we've been talking about together for a very long time and in a great deal of detail because it was essentially your bill. It's House Bill 181355. This is the bill that made multiple changes to the accountability system for schools and districts. That was a big part of our legislative efforts this year. I am happy to go over those specific changes for you again if you want me to. I'll let you tell me that. I'm not seeing that you're asking me to do that, so I'm going to keep talking and just focus more on the implementation issues around the bill. So there are a couple of rulemakings that you all will have to do. One is related to the School Turnaround Leaders Grant Program. That's what it's currently called. One of the things we did in the legislation was change the name of that to School Transformation Grant. Thank you. And in doing so, it wasn't just a name change. The intent was to allow those existing dollars to be used for transformation strategies in addition to leadership. So sometimes leadership is the issue, and sometimes that's the investment that's required. Sometimes it's a different investment would be more productive, and so we wanted to create some additional flexibility with those dollars. So we did that. That's in the legislation, but you all will have some rulemaking around that. Additionally, you guys have rulemaking around a whole bunch of different components of the legislation, right? Again, this was fairly substantive. You'll have to update the performance frameworks because we have some language in there about how those are calculated. The request to reconsider process, which has been a part of your rules, is now a statute, so that prompts some changes you all will have to adopt to your rules. Things around the timing of the clock hearings. There's some language in the bill that relates to the ability to you all directing an action in a time frame that allows that action to be implemented the following school year. So those are a sample. Again, we can go into more detail if you want, but there will be some, I think, fairly substantive components that you all will need to address via rulemaking. Staff is looking at bringing that more substantive rule to you late this year or early next year because there's a lot of components to it. Let's see. Update the application guidance. I think that follows the rulemaking. You all will have some changes to your procedures as a result of the legislation. I mean, one of the key points of the bill is to define in statute what happens if a district or school has reached the end of the clock, you all have directed an action, and they are still on the clock for performance reasons. Statute was silent about that, so now that's better defined, and that will, in the way that you all wanted it to be, but that will require you to adopt some changes to your guidance and procedures. One of the key parts of the bill was the establishment of these community meetings in year 3. By law, department staff are required to attend those meetings and ensure that certain information is communicated to parents in the community at those meetings, so that as we start to cycle through this, we'll have some staff impact. So I think that's the quick summary of that one. Any questions? No? Any yawns? Any stifled yawns?
Did we analyze what this was going to do to you all? I mean, I know they ask for a fiscal note, but they don't ask for a time. Physical.
So Dr. Schroeder, we did, one of the advantages to being part of the drafting process of the bill is we were able to draft it in a way that took into account kind of existing resources and capacity. Mm-hmm. And that was, we had very active conversations about that internally, and we were very cautious to write a bill that people genuinely felt could be implemented within existing resources. So that's how we handled that particular issue. I'm not saying it's not going to be more work for them, because of course it will be, but we were very conscious of that as we were working through the policy and the drafting process.
Is it as though we do more work now and less later?
I think it's just mostly where our focus and where we're putting our time and energy just shifts a little bit. So there's some upfront work to get some work together, but I think the long-term impact of being able to do some of these things sooner with schools and districts as opposed to later will save us time in the long run. So.
And will it be less punitive on school districts, meaning that we will, well, I'm thinking resources right now. Existing resources, well, I don't know if existing resources, when resources are are small. And we somewhat made a decision here when we started all this that we were going to provide resources to schools so that kids would get better. And so this does not take away from that, does it? I mean, that we will still provide resources and maybe more resources if.
So this really allows us to have more flexibility, as Ms. Mello was talking about. The previous use of those state school turnaround leader development funds was really only around leadership, which is important. But where we are with ESSA implementation and how the federal dollars can be used, our schools that were state only identified by the state, the only access to resources they had were for leadership development, which again is crucial, but there's some other needs that may better meet the needs of those individual schools and districts, and now we're going to be able to do that, whereas previously we didn't have any other resources for the ones that were only state identified. So this really allows us to be able to better match individual school needs with the supports available and the resources available.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions so far? Proceed, please.
Okay, so the next thing I'm going to talk to you about is also your bill. So again, I'm going to go a little light on the summary. I'll do better summaries as we get forward, but because we've talked about it so much, I don't want to repeat myself. This is the legislation that we worked on your behalf around the READ Act and making a variety of updates and changes and improvements to the READ Act. From an and one thing just to note that this bill did come with $1 million appropriation. That is additional money for the early literacy grant program. So there's an existing early literacy grant program. It's $4 million a year. As a result of this bill, it will be $5 million a year. And those are very round numbers, keep in mind. But basically, they put $1 million more each year into that early literacy grant. Again, in terms of implementation, you've got some rulemaking around this. I think one is, I don't know if I want to say easier. I'm just going to keep talking. So one is around the early literacy grant program. The bill made several changes to that, including requiring a simplified application for rural districts, and some changes around how funding could be used. So you all will need to address that through rulemaking. And then I think there will be a larger rulemaking process around a lot of the other components of the bill. And I think probably the most critical thing about this bill is, and it's a part that didn't get a whole lot of attention as we were passing it, it requires the convening of a working group to really look at the individual READ plans and think about how do we, so under the statute, because this is sometimes how we have to do things, it says in the statute that group cannot recommend getting rid of individual READ plans. They're not allowed to do that. But the intention is to have a group of people come together and think about how to make those really more meaningful and more substantive and work better for teachers and students and all of that. I'm not a practitioner, I'm a policy person. My understanding is in some places it's already like that. In other places that has been more of a struggle, and it has felt more like a requirement that doesn't really help anybody and doesn't do any good. So we're trying to true up those experiences. Under the statute, the commissioner is given the authority to name the members of that working group, and we're going to start internally here soon, meeting and kind of talking about what that looks like and the different representation. The bill is actually quite non-specific on, it doesn't have that there have to be this many teachers and this many parents or this many Democrats and this many Republicans. It's pretty general. We will work hard, staff, and I know the commissioner prioritizes making sure that is a good, balanced, substantive, representative process. So that is, in my opinion, I think one of the most critical implementation issues. That report, or that working group's work is supposed to be done in March of next year. And that was also written intentionally. Often these working groups, because they want to get the results before the next legislative session, the time frame to do the work gets so compressed that they can't really do that. I mean, they do their best to do a good job, but it's a really compressed time frame. And we wanted to give this a little bit more time. So that was intentional in the legislation. Oh, actually it's not due till February 2020, excuse me. So, see, we gave lots of time. So it'll be a really good substantive conversation. Any questions on that one? All right, I'm going to turn it over to Melissa for a few here.
Okay. So, as you all are aware, there were a number of teacher shortage bills in a package that passed this last session. One of them that we wanted to highlight today was House Bill 1309, the more broad title of addressing teacher shortages. So this bill is the bill that created that Grow Your Own grant program, and along with it, the Teacher of Record license and program. So the Grow Your Own would provide funding to school districts to cover the costs of tuition for up to 36 hours, in-state tuition for up to 36 hours for teachers that agree to teach in that school or district for 3 academic years. So along with it creates that Teacher of Record license for those teachers that are part of the Grow Your Own program. The bill would require, this bill is probably one of the bigger lifts in terms of rulemaking for you all. So in addition to creating new rules for that Grow Your Own Teacher of Record program, it would also require some changes to the current licensure rules for that Teacher of Record license. Another portion of the bill addresses intern authorizations for special services providers. And in doing so, the bill actually addresses 2 current grant programs, the School Counselor Grant Program and the School Health Professionals Grant Program. It changes a couple of the definitions in terms of who's eligible to receive those grants. So those rules that are associated with those 2 grant programs are ones that you're also going to be seeing coming before you this fall or late summer, early fall, in order to continue to provide funding through those grant programs. There are also requirements on CDE to report on the new Grow Your Own Teacher of Record program and to monitor those funds as well. So, any questions on?
I just, thank you, Madam Chair. On the rulemaking grant program, counselor grant program for school health professional grant program.
There are 2 different sets of rules and 2
Okay.
different programs. So
Okay.
you will have
Are
both
they
of
2
them.
different type of people?
Yes, yes.
And one's a nurse and one's a.
One's a school counselors, like we were talking about earlier. So yes, one's in the health field, and then one are the school counselors that deal with also those college career prep type issues.
So what we were talking about before in the school, using some of those funds from the school counselor program, did this change anything?
So
substantively?
this changes who's eligible, so it makes those counselors with intern special services authorizations also eligible for that grant program. So just, it's a definition change that happened in statute and then will correspondingly need to happen in rule as well. Any other questions?
Board Member Goff?
Is this gonna, the rulemaking, will it overlap our just previous today conversation about whether or not someone who is a licensed counselor qualifies as a counselor who's eligible, whose district then becomes eligible or not for these funds? Is it gonna?
Board Member Goff, it is actually a different set of rules. So no, in that sense, they're actually 2 separate issues. The rules you had before you today were the licensure rules, the licensure and endorsement rules. So the rules that actually provide guidelines around whose license can be endorsed as a school counselor. These rules that we're talking about amending are for the school counselor grant program. So they talk about eligibility in terms of who's eligible for a grant under that specific program. So they're kind of separate in that sense.
Who meaning district? You mean?
Yes, so it's districts that then use the funds to hire additional or provide funding for additional counselors. So districts can only apply to CD for the funds, the counselors can't apply to CD directly.
Okay. And may I
Board
ask
Member
a
Flores?
question? So, the counselor is actually to pay for the counselor, or is it for the person to go to school and get their tuition paid?
So this is the school counselor grant program, and Misty's still in here. I think she's the expert in terms of how those funds are actually distributed.
Well, and I can answer that briefly. The School Counselor Core Grant Program is an existing program that's in place. It does not pay for training or college or tuition for people to get a counseling degree or whatever degree leads to that. It is a grant program that is designed to incentivize and encourage districts to hire those types of personnel and to do so in a sustainable way at the largest level. And
Because
Misty,
I-
of course, could be much more detailed.
Because before, you had the Grow Your Own Teacher, where the district, where the tuition would be paid for 36 hours.
Yes, so that is a separate and new program created by the bill. The school counselor program
Okay,
is an
but
existing
the bill
program.
is all together and it's.
Yes, yes, yeah, it
Okay.
just has multiple different aspects.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. See, we told you we were going to start with the substantive heavy lifts first, so hopefully this gets easier as we go. Senate Bill 18225, definition of early college high schools. This is another bill that you all were somewhat engaged in, partly because the way this whole topic was brought up at the Capitol this year was by the Joint Budget Committee analyst for the Department of Education in his briefing to the Joint Budget Committee back in November. And at that point, he expressed some concerns with the growth of early colleges and what that might mean for funding streams in the state. And as a result of those concerns, there were a lot of conversations. The Joint Budget Committee proposed this legislation, which passed. You all supported the bill. And what it does is amends the definition and statute of early colleges to make it really clear that the point of an early college is to be a 4-year program at the end of which you have an associate's degree or 60 credit hours. It does not require that you complete in 4 years, right? So it allows for some flexibility in the sense that if you have a student here or there who needed more help at the beginning and it takes them 5 years to get through, that's still okay under this. But the program can't be designed around that, right? The program has to be designed where, you know, most of our kids are going to get in and out of here in 4 years. There's some exceptions, that's fine. So that's the kind of critical part in terms of the definitions. Because there are some existing entities operating as early colleges that don't meet that definition, the second component of the bill kind of puts a process in place to address that. And you all, again, are given a very significant role in that process. You are directed to review all of the schools that already have that designation and see if they match the new statutory definition.
How many are there?
That is such a good question. I'm sorry. I would guess an answer and it would be bad, so I'm not going to do that. And I'm going to wait for Misty to walk to the table. While I do this, I don't know. I always forget these things are broadcast, so I shouldn't do stuff like that.
About 20.
Yeah, it's 20. 20. Okay.
20, thank you.
20. Thanks, Misty. You can stay there for a
Hey,
minute, just
okay.
in case, if you don't mind. 20. So, one thing the bill does do, so you're going to essentially have 2 categories, right? You'll have existing early colleges who do meet the new definition, and that's a relatively simple category. You'll have existing early colleges who don't meet the new definition. And the bill did specify that they could continue receiving funding the way they have for the next 2 years. So it kind of tried to tail them off instead of just cutting them off immediately from a funding perspective. So
And
again,
when you say cut off, you mean in year 5 and 6 for a student?
so some of the programs that are currently designated as early colleges that would not meet the statutory definition are getting funding for students, yes, that are in a 5th and 6th year.
That's the funding piece we are talking about.
Yes, and so I think the legislatures, I mean, I hate to speak for the legislature as a whole, but I think the perspective was, let's fix this problem, but also let's give people a chance to adjust to that change. Let's not make it so immediate that they are all of a sudden facing a big deficit when they haven't had a chance to make all the changes they need to do to their program if that's what they choose to do. So again, it is a fairly substantive bill in terms of your all's role. The next step really is to establish that criteria, right? So we've got a statutory definition now. We need to flesh that out a little bit. I know that your staff is committed to working with the early college stakeholder community and having those conversations with them before they bring you all something to decide on. So there's a big focus on stakeholder engagement and trying to do this in a way that, one, follows the law, of course, but also makes sense for the practitioners and do it in a responsive way. So that's kind of step 1, and then you have to go through the review process. So once you get the criteria, then you review everything against the criteria. And once you've had those decisions, you got to tell people what the decisions are, right? And they've got to get ready to make adjustments in funding. And Misty, I may, if people have questions about this, ask you to go into a little more detail on this, but will have to hold hearings for early colleges that don't meet the new criteria. And maybe you could speak to that a little bit, because I'm not sure why that is.
So this is part of a broader initial process map that we have not yet brought to you all, but anticipate doing so before next fall, to get your thoughts about how you would like us to move forward with implementation of the bill, as Jennifer Mello outlined. So I think you'll be hearing quite a bit more from staff as far as what the process will look like. So we want to ensure that if once you all set criteria that you would like us to then vet schools, right, existing schools against, if you might want a next step in the process to be a set of hearings for schools that may not meet that criteria. There also, it could be possible for all schools to update their models to then meet the criteria you all establish, but we'll want direction from all of you as far as next steps in that process at some point.
Call myself here. An early college school whose students have already been strong students, who are at grade level when they're freshmen, could fairly easily complete, the majority of them could fairly easily complete within 4 years. And there would be some kids who would need more time, but on the whole, it's a 4-year program because these students are able to move at a certain rate in terms of their learning. When we have an early college in an environment where we don't have the kind of strength in our student body, will there be options to acknowledge that you want to bring the kids to the same place, but it's going to take longer? And the path ought to offer, not asking you.
No, I want to speak after you.
What sort of options would we have, or is that notion now no longer available to us? Do you know what I'm trying to say? That
Sure.
there are going to be some schools where the majority of the students are just not going to move at this. They'll get there, but not at the same rate of speed.
So I think part of your question, Madam Chair, is what percentage of students right now in early colleges are completing in a 4-year period? And that's about 70%. So I think we will be looking forward as staff to working with all of you to determine the type of criteria that you're outlining, which is essentially when, so for example, example criterion might be when will the latest time be that a student could transfer into an early college and be able to still successfully complete, right? Or what does that really look like? So what are kind of the on-ramps and off-ramps to that? Could be a great example of criteria that you'd like to establish.
So what I think it would happen in some cases is that students would enter as freshmen with some deficiencies, some academic deficiencies that need to be made up before they really can be successful and college bound. Is that the sort of thing that we have permission to allow, knowing that would?
You do. And I believe we've heard from existing early colleges that are eager to share the best and promising practices that are happening right now in order to help students accomplish their goal of an associate's degree within 4 years, if at all possible. And so, yes, I mean, you're provided broad authority as far as what criteria might look like.
Great. And then the P-TECH, is that completely different? Because that is a 6-year program.
It is different.
And it still continues as authorized?
It still continues as written in law.
Thank you. Board Member Flores.
Well, I think there was some discussion at the legislature that if programs were more than 4 years, there would be problems in funding. And I know that Denver Public Schools, and I think it was Adams 14, decided to redraw their program because their program was based on something like 6 years or so. Because some of the kids come in with ESL, they're ESL kids, and it might take longer. So there was a question there whether they were, Denver Public Schools was really, heard that it had to be 4 years, and so they had to they were redrawing their program. But I don't know. I mean, Denver Public Schools was one of those schools that was not kind of in the forefront of the P-TECH and all of that was going on in the western part of the state, which had a lot more kids graduating with college credit than, say, over on the eastern front. We didn't have as many. I did some research a couple of years ago, and that was the case, that the western part was already, kind of far ahead on it than, say, the urban districts. And so the urban districts are working, and I know Denver is. So Denver is restructuring their program as we speak and wanting to get it, within 4 or 5 years or so. I'm glad that you stated 5 years, that there could be room for 5, but I think I heard when I went across the street, legislators saying that, that was going to be costly if they did it in longer than 4 years. And
Madam Chair, Dr. Flores, I think what you're pointing out is exactly right, which is that to the extent students in an early college program need a 5th or a 6th year, there are costs to the state.
Yes.
And I think that's exactly kind of what the dialogue was around. This is just my opinion. I want to be really clear about that. I think this bill tried to kind of find a middle ground there and acknowledge some of the things that Dr. Schroeder's bringing up, that, kids start at different places. They may need more time.
Right.
But at the same time, that this was not intended to be a program that essentially pays for 6 years
That's right.
of higher education. So I think they're really trying to strike that balance.
Board Member Jarrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think the problem that the Budget Committee pointed out to the board when we were over there for the hearing is that there was at least one school district that was actively engaged in essentially advertising that you could stay for 6 years, essentially you have your diploma withheld and receive free to them, since there's no free, but free to the student, 2 years of community college at age 19 and 20. And I think correctly so, the Budget Committee probably did a quick calculation on that and figured if everybody did it, the cost was a break-the-bank number. And I think that as we design these rules, what I would hope we would be looking for is programs clearly have to intend to get these kids graduated from high school in 4 years. And not by any stretch, not every high school graduate of an early college does come out with a full associate's or baccalaureate degree, but they usually come out with at least a significant number of college credits, and that has to be the objective. I think where I understand that occasionally you may need a 5th year is for the same reason that you may retain a student for poor performance. And only this case it often takes place because you get a student who's behind grade level and simply can't get there without a little additional time. So I think we have to make these rules pretty clear that you can't game the system. You have to have a program that's clearly designed to graduate from high school a student in 4 years. To the extent that a student can accumulate significant college credits, so much the better. But it's only fair to the legislature, I think, that we try and meet the intent of this legislation.
And we're probably going to get data on what the situation is now to help us.
Yes.
That was going to be my question. Where are we now? What percentage of the students that are enrolled in early colleges actually do the extra 2 years in the 4 years of high school? And do you have any idea how many of those 20 seem to be the ones that aren't in compliance with this particular bill?
So we have that information. We're happy to share it with you. I'm happy to speak more, but I know time is sensitive at this point. We're happy to get that to you for additional decision making and for you to take a deeper look at that, so we do have that information by school. I can tell you generally there's a pretty low number of students that stay for a 6th year. So about 30% then move on for a 5th year, and then it really falls off after that. So that's essentially what you'll be looking at more about.
Yeah, that kind of is my question, and also, is it where they're getting the college credit from, where the weak link is? Like, some don't require the same rigorous as others, and that's why they'll drop off. I know that's what we have to determine through this bill, correct?
Exactly.
So what if I'm just saying, if students at this one school, School A, have been taking credits from a college that's very close by, and then that's not available, would these students have availability through other colleges, like maybe the other 15, or maybe do some of it blended learning online and during the summer? Would those be options that might work?
Those are all options.
Okay.
Yep.
Thanks.
Good question.
It's gonna be fun to dig into that, actually.
Yeah, I want to be on that committee.
Thank you. Move forward.
Yes, Melissa's gonna take the next one.
Okay. So House Bill 1412, we have another one of the teacher shortage bills. This bill would create the Retaining Teachers Grant Program. It's a little bit more broad than the grant programs we discussed earlier. The bill actually appropriated $3 million for this program and awarded the department continuous spending authority for those funds. So this grant program operates on a 3-year cycle. So that's why the department has continuous spending authority for these funds. The grant program itself would be awarded to districts to engage in specified strategies for retaining teachers. So the bill outlines a number of those possible strategies, including things like job sharing, child care services, incentives for highly effective teachers, peer mentorship programs, among others. And so this, again, is another new grant program which you'll have to create and promulgate rules for to set up some of those more specific criteria and detailed operations of the grant program. CDE staff are also obligated under the bill to monitor and audit the use of those funds over the course of that 3-year grant, since it is a longer grant cycle.
So, Ms. Bloom, what would be the source of the ideas of different ways to help retain
So
teachers?
The bill specifies a number of
It specifies
a number of different areas that can be used. State board rule can go into more detail about those or add additional ones. The ideas, obviously, specific ideas will come from the grantees and applicants themselves.
Exactly.
So.
And Madam Chair, I would just add, it being somewhat familiar with how this bill evolved and came through the process, I think part of the intention here is, as part of this entire conversation around teacher shortages and that that the state has been engaged in, I think there was a voice coming from districts of stop telling us what to do and let us go figure out what to do. And I think this is designed to address that request in some ways, right? So it's intended to be somewhat flexible and district driven. That being said, there are parameters established by the statute. It can't just be, we're going to send every of our teachers on a space shuttle trip. I mean, that probably would not, I don't know why you would do that as teacher retention, but I don't think you could do that under the terms of the bill. So it's trying to walk that line between letting innovation come from the local level, while at the same time, keeping it somewhat on track.
Well, I like that because there have been some very innovative efforts across the state that will serve as models. Thank you.
Question.
Board Member Goff.
Thank you. Is it logical to assume that since the grants are awarded for 3 years, the first report or review is not until the end of the 3 years, or?
So the first report, although it won't be as comprehensive, the first report to the General Assembly and State Board will actually, we're planning to, in the bill, it's required in January 2019. So this one will likely be moving a little bit more quickly in terms of rulemaking and getting funding out the door. Now, that first report obviously won't have quite as much in terms of outcome data as the subsequent reports will.
Okay, I'm just, what do we be reporting?
I think we'll be reporting
more of a
on
summary of the design of
the
sort
applicants
of
and
things
what
like that.
what they had requested funding for, and the types of programs that will be funded.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
As you can see, the legislature spent a lot of time talking about teacher issues this year. So Senate Bill 18229 is our next topic of conversation. The intent of this bill is to solve a problem that people in the field were experiencing where if you're a student teacher, so let's say you go to Metro and you are getting your teaching degree and you're in your student teaching component of that, you may do a portion of your student teaching in DPS, you may do some in Aurora, you may do some in Mapleton. It may not all be contained within the same district. And what these teaching students were finding in those cases is that they were having to do separate background checks for all of those employer entities, right? Because every district, and we'll get into this a little bit more when we talk about some other bills, has this obligation, right, to make sure that its employees pass background checks. So this tries to simplify that process, and it does that in two ways. So student teachers can submit to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, CBI, for a background check. That information then comes to the department, this department. The department is tasked with it's a more in-depth review, essentially. It's a criminal records history. So they add another layer onto that. And then the department is required to give this information to any of these school districts that this teacher may be working for, student teacher. And the districts are required to accept it. That's important here, right? Because some of this was, as everything is at the Capitol, negotiated to some extent, but some districts have their own system in place, and they were kind of taking the perspective like, look, we have a system, it's good, no thank you, we don't want your system. But if you're coming from the perspective of that student teacher, that's not particularly helpful. So that's what the bill does. It does explicitly, acknowledging that doing the work to do these criminal history record checks takes resources and effort. It does allow for this department to charge a fee for that service. That will certainly be one of the things that you all will discuss in the implementation and rulemaking process. As a reminder, this is a cash-funded program, so it's kind of a closed loop, right? All the money that comes in gets served for the program and only for the program. So when you increase the program costs, the only way to cover those is by increasing the fees. So how exactly that happens obviously is a complex question, one that you all, I assure you, will have a great deal of input on, and I imagine will be one of your more substantive conversations in terms of implementation. So
$34,000 is.
Yeah, and that's not even, so this is $34,000 in general fund. That goes over to the Bureau of Investigations. So the department was not allocated any general fund dollars to do this. They were given the authority to address the costs through the fee mechanism within the existing licensure system.
So this will take time and effort on the department, but yet it will not pay for the time that department people will have to take on this.
Well, Dr. Flores, to be clear, the department is allowed to essentially recoup those costs from the people who are requesting the license. So yes, you're absolutely right. It requires additional work. There's no doubt about that. And additional work means people and means costs. But the bill says you can essentially recoup those costs. And there's a variety of ways you could do it. You could increase all teacher license fees. You could just have a fee for these particular individuals in this category. All of that is your all's decision-making authority.
Yeah, but the point I want to make is that it's only teachers that have to pay. The other licensed individuals like doctors and such, that they have their department where they do all that work, and they don't have to pay those fees, as teachers have to pay those fees.
That's not our sandbox.
Well, it is. I mean, it's not fair. It is not fair for teachers. I mean, it is not. They have another department for all those licenses where the state pays for it. And here, for teachers, the teachers have to pay for it. The lowest paid people.
Well, Dr. Flores, Actually, in the DORA regulatory programs that I think you're referring to, licensees do pay fees over there. So if you're a physician or a nurse or whatever, whoever all those categories of people are that pursue licensure from DORA, they do pay the fees to cover the cost of those programs as well.
Board Member Wright.
Ms. Mello, again, this is not teacher, this is student teacher, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Thank you for that.
And I'm concerned about the personal information now that will be collected at the department of these student teachers. Will they know if a district has called in and requests that information? Will they be informed of that?
Madam Vice Chair, that is a really interesting question. My limited understanding is that this is, so if I'm a student teacher, I know where I'm applying. I mean, I know where I want to student teach, and I'll bet you I have to sign something that says that school district has the authority to get that information from the department. Now, I don't know that for sure, and that may certainly be something you might want to think about in your rulemaking process around this.
Yes.
So.
Thank you.
Okay. I can't remember if I'm next or Melissa is. I never know till I turn the page. Okay, Melissa's next. Wait, or am I next? No, I'm next. Okay, sorry, my apologies. Okay, House Bill 1269, Parent Notice for Student Safety and Protection. This is a bill we talked about quite a bit as a group. It's an issue that those of you who have been on the board for a long time have been involved with for a very long time. This is a bill you all supported. In its essence, it requires that local education providers, so school districts, notify parents when an employee, and this is where it gets tricky, because when the bill was introduced, the notification happened upon charge. That is not how the bill passed. The way the bill passed is the notification takes place upon completion of a preliminary hearing. I am not a criminal justice policy expert. What I have been told is that is farther along in the process, and at that point, a judge has essentially looked at whatever's going on and said, yeah, there's enough here to go forward. So nobody's been convicted well before that part of the process, but it's not just at arrest or just upon charge. So they moved that into the process. The other thing they did, as originally introduced, the bill was very consistent with, it was the kinds of things that you all can deny or revoke or suspend a teacher's license for were the same things that school districts would have to notify on. That list got narrowed in the legislation, so it is a smaller and the most serious nature of offenses that would require the notification. Notification has to take place within 2 days of that preliminary hearing. They are required to then go back and notify parents of the final outcome, guilty, not guilty, all of that. So that's where the bill landed. Again, you all have some specific rulemaking you're going to need to do, and it's actually fairly technical. So one of the components of the bill says that you all can't waive this. You can't say to a school district, you get to waive certain things for school districts. This is not one of the things you can tell school districts they can't do. And that's what you have to update in your rules. So in your rules, all the things you can't waive, you just need to add this to the list. So it's not, I mean, you all will decide, but I think this one is more of a technical change to your rules than it is particularly substantive.
Ms. Mello, is this the one that initially our board had different votes on, and then they added more amendments to tighten this one up over at the Capitol?
Madam Chair, Madam Vice Chair, yes. The vote to support this bill was not unanimous by the 7 of you. I don't have that on me,
okay.
But I'm pretty sure you voted no.
I know that.
Yes.
I know that.
And I think Dr. Flores may have also been a no vote on it. I'm happy to go back and confirm that.
It doesn't matter the vote. I just wondered if this was the one that after
Yes.
they tacked on the amendments.
Yes, this is the one. And I mean, I think to your point, a lot of the amendments that were made were at least intended, whether they satisfied it or not, to address some of the concerns that you both had raised and that your fellow board members had raised. This is a challenging issue. It's a delicate balance, and I think all of you, those of you who voted to support it, did so understanding the complexity of it, and that this is a balancing act, and that balancing act, I think, got improved or tighter as the legislation
More
proceeded
balanced.
and in the final version, perhaps. I don't know, I was going to say that, but that sounded silly. Okay, Ms. Bloom.
Speaking of bills that you all took a different position on and were narrowed as it went through the process, House Bill 181286 is another example of that bill. This bill would, in its final form, allows medical marijuana to be administered to students by school personnel if there's an agreement, a written agreement between the principal and the parent, and there are details that must be in that agreement as well. Originally, this bill was much broader in the scope, applied to school nurses, but given some feedback, there were significant changes to the bill. As I mentioned, there does need to be the agreement between the principal and the parent for which of the student using the medical marijuana. In addition, there's also a provision that allows for school personnel not to be required to administer the medical marijuana within kind of the confines of the legislation. And in addition, it also gave you all some authority in this policy. You all will need to determine by rule, so this will require rulemaking for you all, the documentation that would be required on behalf of a parent before this policy would actually take effect and the medical marijuana can be administered. The bill does specify some of that documentation that must be included, including the written recommendation from the physician and a statement releasing the school personnel from liability, assuming they follow the outline of the agreement. So again, that is one that I think there will be some policy considerations that will be in front of you when we come to rulemaking for this bill, but it did give you some authority as well. Any questions?
What is the part about review with AG's office to determine?
So I think given the sensitivity and potentially some legal issues that were especially surrounding the original form of this bill, we just want to make sure that when we bring forward rules in front of you all, that they are kind of all in line. We've checked all of our boxes and everything.
So our rules are to be reviewed by the AG's office?
Well, I mean, Madam Chair, I think the intent on staff's part is to consult with the AG's office before putting pen to paper, so to speak, just to make sure that they're clear on the legal context. As we all know, the marijuana, it's a complicated legal arena because federal law is different than state law.
Board Member McClellan?
I really appreciated being able to know how the Professional Association for the School Nurses weighed in on this originally, and if my memory serves me correctly, they were originally opposed because of the difficult position it might put their personnel in. Once we see that there's no longer a requirement for the personnel, the school personnel, to administer the medication, did that make a difference in their position? Did they eventually soften their position of opposition on this bill, or did that concession just kind of happen in tandem to their opposition?
Madam Chair, Board Member McClellan, I want to double check this, and I'm going to do that, but I believe they maintained their opposition to the bill throughout the process. I think it, yes, it got better, but they still had concerns. The original bill would have required them to administer it, and that was quite concerning to a nurse who has a license because, again, just because of this federal and state interaction. So the getting rid of the requirement, I'm sure, was a huge deal.
Yeah.
I don't know that it was enough to ensure their support. And school districts, CASE in particular, was also quite active in negotiating around this bill and had some concerns about just all of that as well.
Right. Well, and don't worry about following up with, for my purposes, on that, because it doesn't make a practical difference for us now, but I was curious and glad to see that that change had been made. Thanks.
Board Member Flores?
Did the governor really sign this?
Madam Chair, Dr. Flores, yes.
Oh, I thought that was one that he wasn't.
Board Member Durham?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Julie, a couple of questions for you. All of this is still illegal under federal law. Would it be appropriate, or do you think it's within our scope of authority in the rulemaking to make sure that the school district provides clear notice to the nurse that if they participate in this, they're probably in violation of federal law? I don't think there's any question they're in violation of federal law, and that they should, since their participation is voluntary, they should probably make an assessment with the full knowledge of their legal status.
Board Member Durham, I think that's an excellent aspect of the rules to contemplate, because it is still a Schedule I controlled substance federally, and as we know, the federal government through a series of interim funding measures has thus far prevented the Department of Justice from pursuing criminal actions in states where it's legal, but the next one of those is due to expire this fall, and I think there's some thought that it may not be renewed. The other thing that comes up in the school context is if there were to be an error of some ilk with a consequence, like an injury, insurance policies generally have an exception where they don't provide a defense. If the conduct constitutes a crime, we've got that same dilemma. Not a crime at the state level, a crime at the federal level. It's a difficult circumstance to navigate.
You anticipated my next question, which is that since, as a general rule, if you violate a statute, strict liability will attach once you get into court. So, notwithstanding the governmental immunity provided under Colorado law, does the attachment of strict liability to this jeopardize any of the governmental immunity that a district and/or school nurse might have as a result of a negligent act?
I could probably argue either side of that, depending on who I'm representing.
You can bet some attorney will.
Yeah, I mean, because certainly the statute's designed to immunize people for relying in the statute in good faith, and so I could certainly say that's not willful and wanton conduct. It's not tortious conduct by school personnel, but certainly in terms of it being an unresolved legal landscape, court could rule the other way.
I think we ought to at least, I would hope you'd take a look when you're advising the department on those two issues, and that the district might also wish to be, we might want to warn them of the potential pitfalls. Thank you.
Okay, we are actually getting close to the end of our substantive bill review. Senate Bill 11, students excused from taking state assessments. This is another bill you all supported, although not unanimously. And I will tell you, this bill has been widely mischaracterized in the media. So every time you read a newspaper story about it, don't necessarily, they just keep saying it the wrong way. They just do. So it doesn't say you can't reward students for taking a test. You still can, if you're a school or a district or teacher, reward students for taking the test. What you are not able to do as a result of this legislation is exclude children who didn't take the test because their parents excused them.
That's right.
So that's all it really says is, if you're going to do a reward structure, you just don't get to not include the kids whose parents didn't want them to take the test.
Yeah, you include everybody.
Yeah, it's pretty simple. This was the pizza party bill. You may remember we had some discussions about this. I call it the why don't we all just be nice bill and invite all the kids to the party. But there was a lot of negotiation we had to do around the complaint process and the penalties. As the bill was introduced, it had a very intense penalty for violations. And violations of this sort are rather challenging to kind of suss out, right? It's hard to know. You're talking about teachers and kids and things that happened 6 months ago and stickers, and it just seemed like the investigatory process that would be required to make kind of a clear determination of a violation was such that it seemed overly burdensome. So we did get that language removed. And now you handle it the same way you do any other complaints of this nature. So if you all get a complaint, the department gets a complaint, one of you gets a complaint about a school district violating anything, right? Graduation, what day graduation should be held on, I think is one that came through recently. You forward those to the district. You work with the district, in a, I think, collegial way, and the parents to try to resolve the issue. So that's it on that bill. One last substantive bill, I promise, and then we'll go to more summary work and stop torturing you.
So I think we can actually speed through this one fairly quickly. So House Bill 1019 makes some changes to the accountability system. It would add an additional measure to the post-secondary workforce readiness indicator. which will be based on the percentage of students that successfully completed an AP course other than English, language arts, or math, and obtained a 3 or higher on the exam. Those students, the percentage of students that also received a B or higher on concurrent enrollment course, and those students that received a 4 or higher on an IB exam other than in the subjects of English, language arts.
Percentage of what?
Percentage of students
In
the district or school.
Yeah.
what?
I think it doesn't specify the exact denominator, so we'll have to work through and see, is that the graduating class, is it the whole high school enrollment? So those will be details we'll work out as we go.
I think that's rather significant
Yeah.
detail.
Right, I don't,
Yeah.
I'll double check, I don't think that's in there. Sorry.
My understanding, my initial reading.
Yeah, I don't think it had that, because I think that question came up, so. We'll figure out what makes the most sense.
Speaking of figuring all of that out, so there will be some work both on the department side in terms of being able to collect that data and additionally put it into the frameworks as well, and then rulemaking for you all for those accreditation rules to include that additional measure. So I imagine that's when a lot of those discussions around what that actually looks like will happen as it gets put into rule.
Well, and just to put a finer point on it, I mean, I think part of the requirement around the IB International Baccalaureate courses was added late in the process. That's not not data the department currently has, and is not sure if it can get access to it or what that process looks like. So that's just one of the things your staff is got to kind of work through, is what does that look like? What does that entail? Can we even get it in order to be able to include IB in particular in these calculations?
So not all districts can offer these things.
Correct.
Was there a discussion about that?
Madam Chair, there was a discussion about this. This is a bill, as introduced, this bill was much broader and bigger, and yes, okay, you remember the history on this.
It's one of my districts, but I'm not I'm a little uncomfortable where.
I mean, I understand what you're saying,
the
and I do
equity
think,
piece here.
yeah, and there were legislators who raised those concerns as it went through the process. At the end of the day, it prevailed in its format, which, you know, I think your point is a very factual one. Some districts can and do offer these, and some don't.
And I think you all will have a point of decision in terms of how much this is weighted in the frameworks. So you'll be able to think about how much weight this should be given overall to the ratings. So if this is something you want to weigh a lot or a little, that's up to you.
So the information that I'll be asking for, I think, is what's the difference if it's by school or by district? IB is not offered in every school, in a district.
Yeah.
Even AP is limited much more, so.
And so the way we are thinking about it, I think the way the bill imagines it, it'll be like the matriculation rate. So we'll report, here's AP, here's IB, here's concurrent enrollment, but the accountability will be at the aggregate level. So it won't matter if you're low in AP but high in IB, or high in concurrent enrollment or low in the others. But there are some schools that may not have great access to any of those
To
three.
any of those.
Most schools have concurrent enrollment, have something, and then,
No, I guess there are 7 or 8 or 17 or something that don't.
yeah. Do you want to hear more?
Yeah, but I don't know why I keep going back there, other than you don't like us.
And while she's walking up here, can I just add something? Okay, so it already gives prizes to kids that are doing well. And if you look at kids that are not, minority kids do not usually get into these courses because, you know, they're not looked upon as being smart. So, you know, it really is kind of a deficit, a deficit for minority kids already, and especially when there's not enough kids. So you're already giving prizes to kids that are in there, and I think they already get enough prizes. And
What are the prizes?
going to college, getting into CU and such, as opposed to maybe thinking about looking at the top % of high schools. the kids who graduate at the top of their class in any high school, we would get more minority kids into CU and into these top courses, as opposed to, you know, giving more prizes to kids that are already, and who, these programs really exclude minority kids. So in a sense, I call them deficit programs for minority kids. We should be doing more for minority kids who really are bright. And we know we are, because, you know, I think intelligence it's just a rule of culture and anthropology. When you study cultural anthropology, that intelligence is distributed equally amongst all groups. And if you look at intelligence in different ways. So, you know, it's a deficit in essence for minority kids. And we should be doing more to think about how to get more kids that are poor, that are minority, into colleges and
Thank you,
such.
Board Member Flores. We need to go.
And
move
it's
on.
for your district, I think. This is for your district, and Angelica, and only for your district.
So, Board Member Flores, just to clarify, so we would make sure at the state level, and I know many districts are doing this too, making sure that we're increasing access and opportunity to IB programs, concurrent enrollment programs, AP courses. We've actually, we'd have to get you the numbers, but we are seeing some increases in more students taking advantage of those courses, and that's one of our goals, is to make sure that minority students, free and reduced lunch students have access to those programs, because we know that they can succeed in those programs, and we know that that
just
helps
offered.
them move on to the next stage of post-secondary
Absolutely.
education. So it's one of our core goals, and I think having more of the programs actually will increase that access.
Misty, I
Was
forgot
there-
what question we had for you, Franklin.
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair. So to address the question that you asked previously, which is essentially, are there gaps in some of these pathway offerings across our state? The answer is yes, and we're taking this up.
Concurrent enrollment, yeah.
So concurrent enrollment, AP, IB, right? We know that not all of these are offered in every school or district across our state. One of the things is we're looking at this as an opportunity to really deep dive into which pathways are offered in which schools and which districts across our state. And then really looking at how can the department be supportive of expansion of multiple pathways, and what does that really look like? Because, you know, most folks offer something, but really there's broad differences in the percentage and numbers of students that are provided one of these opportunities in different ways. So we'll be happy to provide that opportunity, that data.
So I want to ensure that, and one of the reasons I ask about the percentage, that it's not about a 3 or above or whatever percentage based on the number of students who take those courses, because this would actually serve as a disincentive to kids who are going to get a 1 or 2. This is not a thriller to me to begin with, but I know from where it came and what the intent is, it's not something that provides an incentive to students, unfortunately.
We're going to get to some legislation along those lines, just spoiler alert.
Okay. Board Member Goff, do you have your hand up?
Well, then I might wait. I don't remember, is there specific language in here that speaks to the amount of waiting? So that's what we're gonna be getting to deal with. And, you know, I was thinking here today that the whole matriculation, or that one grand area, whether or not we consider putting this into that, just like, it's like a follow-up indicator category or something, I don't know. We can talk about that. I agree with everything both of you just said. And knowing that this is it is aggregate, so it's not school-based, it's some kind of credit that's given to districts. That's what we're gonna have to work out.
That's what we have to figure out.
In our
Yeah.
weighting conversations, I think, but, yeah, this started out a lot more complicated.
Yes.
than-
And Madam Chair and board members, what I would just note for you, I think what's interesting about this particular piece of legislation is, in some ways, it may be a harbinger of a trend we're starting to see where people are looking at the accountability system and how different things are weighted and considered in the accountability system to encourage or disincentivize certain actions on behalf of schools and districts.
Yeah.
So just at the most broad level, I think we may see other types of legislation like this coming over the next few years. We'll see.
Fairness would be a nice piece.
Yes.
That's what has me worried about this.
So
Capacity.
I'm going to try to kind of, so we have gotten through the 10 bills that we really felt like were the most substantive in terms of policy changes and the implementation work the department has to do. As you can see, it's not going to be your last conversation about any of these bills, right? You're going to keep talking about almost all of these, I think, if not all of them. So I want to make sure you know that and how seriously your staff take implementing these bills, both in compliance with statute, but also in compliance with what you all want and the direction you all provide. The rest of this is really just kind of slicing and dicing things a little different. I'm not going to go through it slide by slide necessarily. You have the information if you need it, and you can always ask us follow-up questions. I will just note that there are 3 other bills we haven't talked about so far that provided some funding or FTE for the department. One is an Extend the Advanced Placement Incentives Program. So there's an incentives program right now that deals with trying to get more advanced placement into rural school districts, and one of the bills passed this year was to extend that. There was some legislation around improving the educational stability for foster youth, and there's also legislation that passed around, it's a grant program to pay the advanced placement fees for low-income students, because I don't know what it costs. Like
is
a
expensive.
billion years ago, it cost $65. I will remember that. In 1989, it cost $65, which is the last time I was personally involved. I don't know what it costs now, but it can be a barrier for some students, and so there's a grant program that the department will be administering to help students pay for those fees.
Think about kids that take, that are in 4 classes, and so that's
Yes.
substantial.
Absolutely, and I think that's what the bill was trying to address. The next slide just really, again, calls out rulemaking. I mean, that's such a key role for you all as a state board. I will note that there's a couple of these that I think you've already addressed. You addressed this morning. House Bill 1095, House Bill 1130, and Senate Bill 160. And the 160 may not have been this morning. So it looks like a long list. It's not quite as bad as it might be. Check some of them off the list for now. And then you can just feel free. We talk about, we try to say, here's what does grant programs, and here's some grant programs that aren't in the department, and here's everything else that we have to do. Those are what the next slides are. So I don't want to rush you through any of that. If you have questions about those specific bills, is there anything in any of those slides that you would like me to go into more detail on? Okay. Seeing none, you all know how to get a hold of me, so if there are questions, let me know. And I'm going to let Melissa close us out.
So just very, very quickly, wanted to talk to you all about next steps in terms of this implementation. Like years past, we're putting together that very comprehensive implementation document. We're hoping to wrap that up shortly here. It will have that section, as you've noted in years past, that talks about the state board duties. So that'll outline anytime you have rulemaking or other decision-making authority that might be associated with those bills, and you will be getting a copy of that comprehensive document as well. And then finally, based on that implementation document, I know we've talked a lot about rulemaking. We'll be developing the regulatory agenda for the year, looking at kind of where all of that needs to fall in terms of getting money out the door, making those technical changes. I know you guys have a lot in front of you, so we'll try to align that with everything else that's on your plate, and you will also receive a copy of the regulatory agenda once it's finalized.
Member Rankin?
This is excellent work. Thank you very much. The top 10 summaries everything about that. The next question I was going to ask was the bullet points, and it was on the next page. What I would like to see, is this online? Or can you send me a digital?
Madam Chair, Madam Vice Chair, I believe it's on board docs, but we can also email it to you.
On the board docs, sure. What I'd like to see is, even if it's on our board doc, as this progresses, at least for the top 10, each one, the next steps, and so we can see which ones are accomplished and which ones are not, if it applies to us, especially for a vote.
Yep.
Just so we don't sit down with a thick document the day that, so we can kind of look ahead and see what's going on, if that's possible and not that much work. But just for the top 10 is
I think that makes perfect sense and
Thank
is
you
very
very
doable.
much. This is great, Jennifer.
So I've been asked a number of times, what are we going to do now that we've adopted standards? Thank you for answering that question. Board Member Ralph?
We didn't want you to get bored.
I told you that a couple of months ago, but I was afraid to figure it out. I would, just a quick question, it's back on the additional bills that authorize new grant programs or expanding, see a page number. Just a, well, it's on the previous one too, school finance, what do we do with that? Because I don't remember, we haven't ever really actively gone in.
Madam Chair,
No.
Board Member Goff, excellent question, and I had the same question myself yesterday when I was preparing for this, so I have an answer. One of the things the School Finance Act did was change, it made a very technical change to the ELPA distribution formula to basically get money that the legislature was appropriating out the door. And so you all will need to have again, I think a rather technical change to your rules. Oh, you already did it?
You'll be seeing the notice of rulemaking this afternoon.
Yeah, I was just
Okay.
going to say.
Okay.
That
So
sounds
it's,
familiar.
yeah, but it's a fairly, it's not the whole School Finance Act, it's just that one technical component. Okay. Thank you all. I know that you're short on time. I just want to say thank you very much for trusting me. It is really a pleasure to represent you at the legislature. We had a great year, and soon we'll start talking about another great year. Thank you.
In between, rest up. Thank you so much, both of you. Next item on our agenda is a discussion on the fiscal year 1920 budget request. Commissioner? And I think we have something
Are
handed
you
out to us.
guys able to manage this before lunch?
Well, it's a real short one. Would you rather do it after lunch?
Yeah, I'd rather do it after lunch.
Do we, I don't know that we have an exec session item.
Maybe give us
Would
a
you
little
want
time to walk.
It's at the pleasure of the board.
All right, let's go have lunch. I don't want to listen to this.
No. Do we?
Oh, I'm
just
so sorry.
Looking at
Jennifer.
Jeff out there.
Do we have anything to talk with the
Yes.
Donald lawyer?
Yes.
Executive session.
You may go back.
Okay, I guess we're gonna continue on
Continue on with what?
with our budget discussion. So, I'm gonna turn this over to Jennifer Oakes, our Chief Operating Officer. You have, this PowerPoint in front of you from this morning. And so you can pull that out, probably right here. So, yes. I'll just introduce this topic really quickly. This is just, as soon as the legislative cycle ends, we're already into the next one, and we've had some time because we have requirements to submit some things to OSPB, and so we've been looking sort of across the department to look forward to the future on what we may be needing in terms of some budget requests. And so this is the first high-level discussion on that, just to take your temperature on a couple ideas we have, and so I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Oakes.
Great, thank you. Jennifer Oakes, Chief Operating Officer, as Katie mentioned. So this is really just the start of the discussion. I think the meat of the discussion will come in August, after you give us a little bit of direction today on where you want us to dig in and research further. So today, let's see, we'll just give a real quick overview of the budget process to reorient you. We just finished the legislative cycle, but we're starting here again. Highlights of our budget, and some of those areas that we've identified as potential areas that we wanted to bring forward to you all to, again, take your temperature, get direction from you all, to figure out how we should move forward. So just a real high level is, right, what we have been doing is to do an internal assessment of our budget compared to the strategic organizational needs. And so then we're here today to present those ideas that we've come up with to you all to get your feedback and guidance and direction on that. Then in August, we'll need to notify the Office of State Planning and Budgeting on those areas that we're considering we want to pursue as decision items. And then once it goes through the OSPB budget balancing process, then with their approval, it goes into the November 1 budget request that goes over to the Joint Budget Committee. And so then the legislative cycle begins. We have our briefing with the JVC staff member, then follow-up hearing questions, and then the figure setting will proceed in March. And so just a reminder, when we were looking at all of our budget needs, we really brought it back to that strategic focus areas. And so to make sure that there's alignment with those areas. Oh. Okay, this doesn't look super great up here, so I apologize. The overall budget is $5.1 billion, but the overwhelming majority of that is distributions to the school districts. It's school finance, in large part the state share, but then also the grant programs as well. 2.5% of that is the state level administration, so for CDE staff. And so that's $130.8 million is that 2.5%. So the next one.
But that's the state budget. This doesn't include federal.
That does include
Does
state
include-
and
yeah.
federal,
Thank
yes.
you.
The estimate
Sorry.
of the federal. And so again, I apologize for the lack of details on this slide. This is the
We have it.
breakdown.
We have
Oh,
it.
you have it, okay. The $130.8 million, that's broken down between salary, so that's the 34%, operating 34%, and then contracts. And so those contracts, examples of those are like the Pearson, College Board, some software and hardware licenses for the IMS, those types of things. So the strategic budget needs that we've identified as staff, as we look through that, is 4 sort of potential requests that are up for consideration, and then the 2 that are statutorily required. So the total program funding that we have to do every year, the categorical funding. So of course those will be part of it because it's required. So the 4 will go into more details here. So the school transformation grant funding. This is sort of a follow-up to that first bill that Ms. Mello just presented, and this is really in support of that schools improving strategic effort. So about 80,000 of our students are enrolled in priority improvement or turnaround systems, and the state funds turnaround support for about 22% of those schools. So if we have an opportunity to be able to identify approved academic outcomes if we can have additional funds for that. So that is one area for consideration. The next one is addresses both school quality and more options, both of those strategic areas. So this is related to the schools of choice and innovation. Right now, the charter sector, we have about 250 charter schools serving 13% of the students in the state. 90%, the majority of those schools are mature schools. They're no longer startup programs. They've been in existence for some time now. And so the needs of those schools have shifted from startup. There's very different needs than these mature schools that have been in place for a long time. Meanwhile, the federal government and the funding for charters has really focused on that startups and expansion. So that is transitioning as our charter sector matures. So we think that further discussion is needed on what's the role in CDE in that charter sector and how to make sure that we're best fulfilling those statutory goals and statutory requirements.
That's interesting.
The next one is, again, in that more options, and this is concurrent enrollment support. So this we thought it might be good to revisit. This was a couple of years ago where a decision item was put forward to get additional funding for dedicated staff member. That there could be some opportunity or some barriers for concurrent enrollment, especially for the small and rural districts that aren't as sophisticated. And so that dedicated support at the department could support that, not only the 30,000 or so kids who are currently taking advantage of those, but to expand that, as was discussed earlier. And so that, again, supports that post-secondary attainment. Strong foundations, this is more of a procedural than a strategic. So in 2011, a bill was passed to create a tax checkoff program for taxpayers, when you pay your taxes, to check off and donate a portion of your refund to the Colorado Preschool Program.
Let's let her finish and then we'll go
Well,
back to these.
it's just that she skipped over some questions that I had on page.
Yeah,
well,
just a minute and then we'll get back to you as far as.
Finish the slide.
Yeah.
So there's approximately $312,000 in that fund, and in order to use that, we would need spending authority. So that's more procedural.
And it would go then to the preschool program, which we run.
Right. And so then staff is looking at alternatives that would best meet the needs in the field. And so, you know, depending on the direction today, we bring back more details for you. So, go back a slide.
Yeah,
Board Member Flores, your questions?
First of all, in reading, I think that the perception of people in the country, and specifically in my district, is that we have enough charter schools. And it's not going for charter schools, even though the federal government is putting more money, it has more money available for charter schools. But I think that the zeitgeist of where, you know, what people are thinking about is that they want public schools, more public schools rather than, than private charter schools, which are private. And so.
They're public.
Oh, come on, just because the public
Guys,
gives
we're
money
hungry,
to
so
private
let's-
schools.
let's not stir
doesn't
up
make
the
it,
pot. What's your
doesn't make
question?
it prop,
What's your
doesn't make it
question?
private.
What's your question?
So I'm
Tom?
saying that,
For Ms. Masnick here.
well, it's not
Yeah,
for
we
Ms.
need somebody to take
Masnick.
care of-
I think that's what people are thinking. I mean, if you wanna know what people are thinking here in this state, and, you know, they're thinking that they want higher wages, because there's still a lot of poor people here, and the economics of this state are going up, but a lot of people are not making it. So I think that's one. They want to get good education and they want to support public schools. I think that's
Thank you.
another thing.
Thank you.
And
So we want to hear from the charter.
Excuse me, I haven't finished.
I know, but you know what? We're hungry and you want to walk, so this is just not going to work. If there are
That's always,
services.
I
if
never
there are
get 5
services
minutes. That's
that-
not fair. I never get the time
Please,
to
please.
finish what I'm thinking, and that is not fair. Other people get the time, I do not, and I think that is racist.
Thank you, Board Member Flores.
There it is.
So, in terms of the charter piece, I think an important question is what are the services that the mature charter community seeks from the state board? Because
Yeah.
I think that's an important piece. We're not talking about new charters here, we're talking about the charters that we have.
Right. This is.
Staff believes there are some additional needs that they have that we historically have provided.
Yeah.
Matures.
Yeah, the mature charter schools, so the Colorado Charter Schools Act has a number of requirements in it, and so how are we addressing those needs? But I think there's a lot of legal questions to support the authorizers and the charter schools to make sure that they are, you know, appropriately supporting those. And then also how, and Bill Cuttensteady is probably better able to address a lot of these details, but really, you know, there's a lot of work that comes with those innovation statuses and the charter waivers, and so that's a lot of work that goes into that, to preparing, working with the charter schools, those authorizers, to bringing up good information for you all
So
to
you're
make
gonna be
those
providing
waivers.
us that in August when we look deeper into
Right,
this?
yes, Madam
Commissioner?
Chair, and we have some of this, I think the question is about, and we can provide some of this to you in the interim as well, and we can bring it up in August as well, but you actually do a fair amount of work to support charter schools right now as a state, and we have state laws that require us to support charter schools and to bring all of those waivers to you and prepare you all for that, and our funding right now comes from the federal government regarding new startups. And so we've taken this opportunity to really see our landscape shifting and say, is it time now for the state to have some dollars involved in this? Since you know, much of what we do now is state required items. And so we have done some initial research on that around all of the things we do provide now. Obviously that's up to you if you all think that that's important and should continue to be supported. But that really is the sort of crux of this matter, is as this landscape changes, the needs of the dollars change, and so maybe not relying as much on the federal dollars and thinking about what state dollars should be involved in this.
Great, thank you. Board Member Wright?
I have a quick question, maybe, I don't know who to. But it says here, additional board member questions. Can we send those in between now and August so that we don't do it now, we still have time to question some of these things?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And that would be sort of our intent of this piece, is just taking your temperature, getting, are these the right things to focus on? If so, what questions do you have? And then we can prepare those details.
I guess the first question I'm thinking about is, how are our charter schools doing? I mean, that's what I would like to know. And I'd also like to know how they compare to the charter schools in the other states. You know, where do we stand? I know I did see the article about our 8th graders, and they seem to be doing quite well, but to get a bigger picture of charter schools.
Absolutely.
The concurrent enrollment topic, I don't know if staff is prepared by August to give us sort of an update. I know that when this appeal went down, there was data on how many districts wanted more help, how many districts didn't have concurrent enrollment because it was too challenging. What would be the role of, if we were to fund an FTE or part of an FTE, what would be the role of that individual? But I think most of us encourage our districts to engage in that. We make a point to tell our parent community that this is an opportunity. So I don't expect this one to be declining unless something changes dramatically.
Yeah.
But some help on that would be really great.
Yeah, we can provide
Any
that.
other questions? Board Member Flores?
Just a statement. I mean, most of our work is on charter schools. I would say 95% of the time that we spend here is spent on charter schools and reading about charter schools. So, I mean, we should just call it the Charter School Board instead of public schools. It's a lot about charter schools. And I've been taking notes as how much time is spent, and close to 90% of it. And then we have the public that really believes that we should be working on public schools. And I think most rural schools understand that, believe it or not.
Charter schools are public schools.
Oh, they're not.
Board
We're
Member
the-
Goff?
just because the public pays for private schools that have their own, you know, and the people across the street just give the money. Now listen to what happened yesterday with the BEST program. In the BEST program, there was that charter school that paid 3%, and they're paying 95% of building that school. I mean, is that right? And then probably some person down in Delaware, like the Walmart people, are the ones that are going to be ending up owning most of our schools. That's what's going to happen.
Board Member Goff, do you have a
Thank you.
question?
It's going to go into
Maybe.
private hands.
I don't know, Jennifer, I'm sorry, a little overview quick as you want to make it on the tax checkoff funds. Are we, I mean, there is the Colorado preschool program is mentioned here on this, or are you waiting to get to that part? Am I interceding on your?
No, so that checkoff was created back in 2011 by the legislature, and so the tax checkoff that taxpayers have been able to voluntarily contribute to over the past few years was for the Colorado preschool program. And so that's the general topic of what they donated to. And then, so now there's funds in that fund balance available, but then a decision item would be needed to get the spending authority. And then part of that decision item, if we were to proceed with it, would be for us to outline how specifically we would recommend using those funds, but would have to be within the Colorado preschool program, within that statutory intent of the program that was created back in 2011. Did that answer?
Yeah, yes, and has CDE, have we had any ever in the past, in addition to that one? I seem to have recollection of others in the past that were ed related, K-12 related, but P-12 related. Is that the only one that's still sort of in operation?
This is the only one currently in operation. I would have to look to see if we've had any in the past, because I can't think of any right now, but that could be my memory. So we can check into that.
Is there, and maybe you'll speak to this, has there been some discussion about brainstorming other possibilities for this? Or do we need legislation in order to initiate something brand new? Doesn't that require
Right.
rules?
Board Member Goff, I think, yeah, it would be up to you if you would want to initiate something like that. I think I've heard, as I've learned a little bit about this, that it's actually a pretty arduous process to get a tax check off, and there's a long, it's probably not exactly accurate to say waiting list, but a lot of programs and organizations want to be on the tax check off. And so I think at one point it was sort of said, well, for the dollars we get, is it really a return on investment? And so, you know, that obviously is up to the board if you would like to spend your energies there, but the dollars is not a huge amount, and so we would, you know, reinvest this into current programs, but it would probably end up being a small amount for different programs.
I'm not advocating one way or another.
Got it.
Board Member Shepherd.
I just wondered if you were able to make the connection between the 250 charters, the fact that they're mature in their functioning, and that they need different kinds of resources than would be provided by a startup grant. Is that where you were headed with that?
Yes.
And then,
Yeah.
so it'd be nice at some point just to know how the charter school units is structured and how the charters are currently being served, what's not getting done, and I don't know if there's any satisfaction surveys that you send out to constituents, you know, who are served by these units, just to get a sense of what do the charters need and want that currently isn't being addressed by the startup grants. So, thank you.
Great
And I
point.
think it
We
includes
can-
innovation as well.
Yes.
And innovation.
Yeah.
Great. Okay.
Does that cover?
That covers what we need. So it sounds to me like, I mean, these other two are just required elements that you'll see.
Yep.
But it sounds to me, unless you have any objections, that you would want us to bring some more detail on each of these and probably work with you in the interim to answer some of your questions about those and then provide some dollar amounts.
Are there any serious objections to these? Good. You picked a good bunch. Could you call us into exec session and then we'll get some lunch? Go to the bathroom and get some lunch and come back, please.
Start with the last part. Okay. An executive session has been noticed for today's State Board meeting in conformance with 24-6, 402-3A CRS to receive legal advice on specific legal questions pursuant to 24-6, 402-3A Roman numeral 2 CRS, matters required to be kept confidential by federal law or rules or state statutes pursuant to 24-6, 402-3A Roman numeral 3 CRS.
Thank you.